What if the biggest injustice in Hogwarts history never happened? What if the boy in the dungeons with the broken accent and the two big hands wasn't sacrificed to protect a prefect's spotless record? Tonight we deconstruct a timeline where Rubeus Hagrid is accused in the bowels of the castle, and believed. The air in the dungeons is wet and metallic, torches spitting as if the castle itself is nervous. A third-year Hagrid stands ringed by auras and teachers, his shoulders hunched, his wand clutched awkwardly in fingers made for tree trunks, not you. Across from him, Tom Riddle holds the room the way he always does. Calm, immaculate, his prefect's badge catching the firelight as he repeats the accusation that will, in canon reality, fracture another boy's life. The creature, the attacks, the girl in the bathroom. In the original timeline, this is where silence does the real damage. But silence is a choice, and tonight, Albus Dumbledore refuses to make it. The turning point arrives not with a spell, but with a sentence. "Mr. Riddle," he says, voice level but edged with steel. "You will provide evidence, names, times, locations. Vague horror is not proof." The subtext is brutal. Charm is no substitute for structure. Around him, the dynamic shifts by degrees. McGonagall, younger but already formidable, narrows her eyes and asks why Tom, so observant, waited until the attacks escalated to speak. An aura, quill hovering, notes that Hagrid has never once been seen near the scenes, while Riddle always, somehow, discovers them. For the first time, suspicion begins to orbit away from the half-giant boy and toward the golden child at the center of the room. Hagrid barely understands the mechanics of what's happening, but he understands power. He feels it moving. A moment ago, it was a tide about to sweep him out of the only home he has ever known. Now it's stuttering, redirected by a handful of questions. Imagine the psychological fracture inside him. Terror of expulsion grinding against a fragile, impossible hope that maybe they will listen. That maybe his word is worth something against Tom Riddle's perfect diction. Because the core issue is mechanical as much as emotional. If Hagrid keeps his wand, he keeps his education. If he keeps his education, he keeps an identity that is more than Gamekeeper and almost expelled. His loyalty to Hogwarts, already absolute, would be met not with quiet pity but institutional trust. A fully trained Hagrid is not a joke with a pink umbrella. He is a licensed wizard whose magic, theory, and raw physicality form a different kind of power on the castle's chessboard. Zoom out from this dripping corridor, and the implications start to multiply. A Tom Riddle who is doubted this early does not walk into adulthood with an unblemished reputation. A staff that never sacrifices Hagrid may, years later, hand him a professor's post instead of a set of keys. And a boy named Harry Potter will eventually arrive at a Hogwarts where his first guide is not a marginalized outsider, but a respected half-giant whose life was never shattered in these dungeons. So what happens to the chamber, to the war, to the final night on these battlements when Hagrid stands there fully trained? To answer that, we have to follow this corridor out of the dungeons and through an entirely different history of Hogwarts. We deconstruct a timeline in this corridor. In canon, it ends in a locked door, Hagrid's third year, a dead girl in a bathroom, and Tom Riddle holding out a neatly packaged culprit. The basilisk goes back into the walls, the diary goes back into his pocket, and Hagrid's wand goes back into Dumbledore's desk in 3 jagged pieces. In that reality, the Ministry expels him, snaps his wand, and quietly allows him to remain as Gamekeeper, a half-trained teenager suddenly promoted to adult labor. He lives in a hut on the edge of the forest, not a dormitory. He drinks in the 3 broomsticks, not the staff room. He becomes Harry's first guide to magic precisely because he is a marginal figure, tolerated but never fully trusted, a living reminder that Hogwarts can cast you out and still use your strength. Imagine the psychological fracture of that life. The trauma is not only the loss of spell work, it is the message encoded in every sideways glance from Fudge, every Daily Prophet headline that treats him as a convenient monster when the chamber reopens. The core issue is mechanical. When you cut off a wizard's education at 13, you are not merely limiting their power level, you are freezing their identity at the moment of accusation. Hagrid internalizes the role of dangerous outsider so thoroughly that even his loyalty expresses itself through apology. In this alternate structure, the turning point arrives in that dungeon office and simply tilts the other way. Dumbledore believes him, pushes back against Riddle's immaculate lie, and Hagrid keeps his wand. He returns to class the next morning under a cloud of whispers, yes, but he returns as a student, not a condemned half-giant on probation. The subtext is brutal for Tom. His first crime fails, his reputation acquires hairline fractures, and the myth of his untouchable brilliance never quite solidifies. From here, our journey is precise. We will follow Hagrid year by year through a full Hogwarts education. The awkward giant at a too-small desk in Charms, the boy who can finally back his affinity for creatures with actual theory in care of magical creatures, the teenager learning to channel raw physical presence into controlled defensive magic. We will watch him graduate, take a staff position, and eventually inherit care of magical creatures, not as a consolation prize, but as a professorship he has earned. Along the way, we will map how this empowered Hagrid reshapes each book's central conflict. What happens in Harry's first year when the man who collects him from the hut on the rock is a respected professor, not the school's tolerated oddity? How the Chamber of Secrets investigation plays out when the original scapegoat is now a key witness. What it means in the final battle to have a fully trained half-giant anchoring the front lines rather than being swept aside. This is not simply power-scaling Hagrid for spectacle. It is an inquiry into prejudice. What changes when the wizarding world is forced to treat a half-giant as competent, articulate, and magically authoritative from the beginning? Who does that man save when Harry falls from his broom? When Buckbeak is sentenced? When giants are courted for the war? And, uncomfortably, who does he have the power to destroy if his loyalty is ever betrayed? In the next section, we return to that bathroom, to that diary, and to a 13-year-old Tom Riddle discovering that his first attempt at rewriting Hogwarts' history has failed. We return to the dungeons, but the script does not follow canon. The dead girl in the bathroom, the whispers of a monster, the pressure on Armando Dippet to keep parents calm. All of that is the same. But this time, when Tom Riddle offers up a trembling third-year half-giant as the convenient answer, the headmaster meets resistance. Dumbledore does not raise his voice. He simply states a principle. No expulsion without proof, and certainly not for a boy whose very identity already makes him a target. In a school where bloodlines are currency, a half-giant with a known affinity for dangerous creatures is the easiest narrative. The core issue is mechanical. Dippet wants a name he can write in a letter to the board. Dumbledore wants an investigation. So, an inquiry structure forms almost overnight. Professors comb the castle, not for legends, but for evidence. Hagrid, wand still technically in his possession, is questioned alongside his beloved Acromantula. The spider is contained in a reinforced classroom, examined by a wary Professor Kettleburn and a fascinated Dumbledore. Its venom, size, and abilities are catalogued. Crucially, its fear is catalogued as well. This is a predator that is terrified of something deeper in the castle. Teachers fan out to interview students. They map who was where when the attacks occurred. Tom's name keeps recurring near the edges of those maps. He was in the library again researching Hogwarts' earliest years. He was seen in the second-floor corridor minutes before the first attack, though his official statement omits that detail. We deconstruct a timeline, and the neat, heroic narrative Tom offered Dippet begins to fracture under simple cross-examination. In the staff room, the dynamic shifts almost imperceptibly. Tom performs innocence with the same polished charm that once won him every prize. But when Dumbledore presses, asking why Tom was so certain the monster was a creature, why he knew the legend in such detail, a flicker of irritation breaks through. His smile is a fraction too delayed. His eyes, for a heartbeat, are cold. Imagine the psychological fracture, not in Tom, but in the adults who suddenly glimpse that their golden boy may be acting on a different script entirely. Yet Hogwarts is not ready to expose him. The political reality is suffocating. To accuse a brilliant orphaned prefect of opening a mythical chamber is to admit that the school itself is unsafe in ways no scapegoat can fix. So a compromise takes shape. Dippet quietly denies Tom certain privileges. No special awards this year, no extra authority over younger students. Dumbledore begins a quiet surveillance, engineering excuses to intersect Tom's path, cataloguing every slip. Somewhere in the depths of the castle records, a sealed parchment is filed. Concerning behavior, obsession with school history, presence near scenes of trauma. It is not a conviction, it is a warning label. Tom understands it perfectly. As the inquiry winds down, he passes Hagrid in the corridor outside the Great Hall. The half-giant is pale but unexpelled, flanked by professors who now see him as frightened rather than guilty. Tom's gaze lingers. Calculation, not rage. Hagrid is no longer a pawn to be sacrificed. He is the first witness whose continued survival might cost Tom everything. The turning point arrives in that silent stare. Tom realizes he has been seen, if only partially. The subtext is brutal. If he cannot erase suspicion, he will have to redirect it with far greater precision next time. So when that diary is opened decades later, it is not just a weapon. It is a revenge mechanism, calibrated against the boy who lived and the man who refused to die on command. The question is, how does a 13-year-old memory of Tom Riddle adapt when his original cover story has already failed once? What if that failure forces Riddle to pivot, and the boy he tried to erase walks back into class the next morning? Imagine the psychological fracture in the Great Hall when Rubeus Hagrid, accused and then cleared, drops onto the Gryffindor bench with his wand still whole. The whispers do not vanish with the ink on the report. They follow him into Charms, where he moves through the doorway like a siege engine trying not to scrape the stone, and sits down with deliberate care. His wand, full length, not hidden in an umbrella, looks wrong in his hand only because everyone has been trained to imagine it snapped. He does not make a speech. He opens his book, stares straight ahead, and refuses to flinch when a first year at the next desk inches away. The core issue is mechanical. Hagrid has lost weeks to interrogations and inspections. He is behind on theory that was already fragile. Arithmancy becomes a wall of symbols that never quite resolve into meaning. In Transfiguration, wand movements that require delicacy clash with hands built to lift crates of hippogriff feed. But now the dynamic is different. He is not a tolerated charity case awaiting expulsion. He is a student Dumbledore publicly defended. That public loyalty translates into private labor. McGonagall, still young but already terrifyingly precise, keeps him after class. She does not lower the bar, she extends the timeline. Extra drills on matchsticks, slower demonstrations, brutally honest feedback about discipline rather than blood. The subtext is brutal. If he fails, it will not be because the castle betrayed him, but because he walked away from the work. That clarity, harsh as it is, gives him a structure to push against. In Care of Magical Creatures, still an elective overseen by a rotating cast of less imaginative professors, the equation flips. Here, Hagrid is not behind. He is ahead in a language nobody else quite speaks. He handles a skittish hippogriff with the same instinctive respect he once showed a spider in a cardboard box. Where others see danger, he sees personality. In defense against the dark arts, that same instinct fused with raw courage becomes an asset. Shielding charms are clumsy, but he stands his ground against boggarts and jinxes in a way that makes more polished students quietly recalibrate their definition of power. Around the staff table, his name shifts registers. Dumbledore begins inviting him for tea under the pretext of checking on his progress, but the conversations drift into ethics, creature rights, and the politics of fear. Slughorn, ever the collector, eyes Hagrid's potential, half-giant strength, unusual magic, proximity to Dumbledore, and briefly considers a Slug Club invitation, then thinks of his more Prejudice members and hesitates. Even that hesitation is data. It teaches Hagrid that talent does not erase blood in other people's equations. Slowly we deconstruct a timeline where his identity is not anchored in disgrace, but in persistence. Detentions taper off, not because he becomes smaller, but because the castle learns to accommodate his presence as normal. He starts helping professors with creature-related tasks, unofficial at first, then semi-formal, until the idea of Hagrid future staff member stops sounding like a punchline and starts feeling like an inevitability. The turning point arrives late one evening when he looks up at the staff table and, for the first time, does not imagine himself serving their tea or carrying their crates. He imagines a chair with his name on it. The reality has not caught up yet, but the possibility exists, and once that door in his mind opens, the question is no longer whether Hogwarts will keep him. It is what, exactly, Hogwarts will one day trust him to teach. The answer arrives in the most mundane way imaginable. Exam results, not a phoenix, not a prophecy, just parchment. Hagrid's OWLS are uneven in a way that makes the staff room pause. Abysmal in astronomy, shaky in potions but unexpectedly solid in defense against the dark arts, and quietly exceptional in care of magical creatures. When we deconstruct a timeline where his education continues, those sparks are not extinguished by expulsion. They are fed. He sits his NEWTs under the weight of a castle that once almost condemned him, and walks away with enough qualification to be employable, not merely pitied. The core issue is mechanical. With a complete education and an intact wand, his magic stabilizes into something deliberate rather than explosive. Stunning spells that once blew doors off hinges become clean arcs of red light. His shield charms are not elegant, but they are brutally strong, powered by a body that understands physical resistance and a psyche that has survived public suspicion. In defense, he is never theoretical. He is the man who has stared down acromantulas and lived. So when the aging care of magical creatures professor retires in the late 70s, the decision that, in canon, never existed suddenly becomes a fulcrum. Dumbledore could choose a traditional academic, polished, pure blood, safely predictable. But reality has shifted. Hagrid has years of assistant work on the grounds, a reputation for loyalty, and an almost uncanny rapport with creatures other wizards label monstrous. The turning point arrives when Dumbledore does not treat him as a charity case. He appoints Rubeus Hagrid because on paper and in practice, he is the best person for the job. The promotion changes geography before it changes psychology. Hagrid keeps the hut, the pumpkin patch, the sense that the edge of the forest is his threshold. But now there is an office in the castle, lined with mismatched chairs for visiting centaurs, a nameplate on the staff room door, a wardrobe of slightly ill-fitting staff robes that never quite contain his shoulders. At meals, he is no longer hovering behind Dumbledore's chair with jugs of pumpkin juice. He is seated at the high table, his goblet beside McGonagall's. Imagine the psychological fracture this creates in the institution. For Minerva and Flitwick, there is a quiet, almost parental pride. The boy they watched be nearly sacrificed to hysteria now co-authors curriculum. For certain governors, the subtext is brutal. A half-giant in authority in front of their children. Snape, newly installed and already raw with his own traumas, bristles at Hagrid's imprecise one-work and emotional grading, dismissing him as another symbol of Dumbledore's radical inclusivity. Yet the dynamic of power has shifted. Hagrid is no longer the lovable, underestimated outsider who can be safely ignored until a crisis requires a scapegoat. He is a respected, if controversial, expert whose syllabus normalizes blast-ended scroots alongside bowtruckles, whose presence forces Hogwarts to treat werewolves, giants, and even house elves as subjects of ethical debate rather than background scenery. What does it do to a generation of students when monstrous beings are introduced not as threats, but as neighbors with their own histories and identities? That question will matter when Harry finally walks through the doors and discovers that the man who meets him at the lake is not just keeper of keys, but professor. By the late 70s, the lakefront professor with the booming laugh has become something else entirely. An unofficial line in the sand. Voldemort's influence is bleeding out of drawing rooms and into open violence, and as we deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid kept his wand, we also have to ask a darker question. What happens when the boy who framed you for a monster grows up to lead an army of them? In Slytherin circles, the whispers come first. Tom Riddle's old classmates, now masked and marked, remember the awkward half-giant he tried to pin a murder on. They remember that it failed. There is a quiet, inconvenient legend that at Hogwarts, Riddle once lost. The subtext is brutal. Every time a Death Eater recruits from that cohort, Hagrid's continued presence on the staff is living, breathing evidence that Voldemort can be wrong. On paper, the Ministry calls it a war for unity. In reality, the structure of their response is riddled with prejudice. Fudge's predecessors signed decrees about solidarity while, in private, they hesitate to arm a half-giant with full aura-level clearance. Hagrid is useful, they say, for moving obstacles, guarding doors, wrangling creatures. But a wand-bearing half-giant in the field? That feels dangerous. To their hierarchy, not to Voldemort. Dumbledore ignores them. On Order of the Phoenix missions, Hagrid becomes a tactical asset that canon never allowed him to be. He apparates with teams to rural safe houses, his sheer size and reinforced shield charms turning cottage doorways into fortresses. When giants are courted by Death Eaters, Hagrid is the one who can walk into a camp of creatures the size of lorries, speak their language, and quietly redirect them away from Muggle cities. In duels, he is a living shield, taking curses on layered Protego and bone reinforcement spells, buying seconds that mean survival. The core issue is mechanical. A fully trained Hagrid understands how to fuse his physical resilience with structured magic. He learns to anchor defensive wards directly into the ground with his weight, to use environmental transfiguration to throw boulders rather than blasting curses near Muggle roads, to stun 3 masked figures at once with sweeping, almost physical arcs of light. His power is no longer accidental, it is engineered. Yet imagine the psychological fracture behind that power. Hagrid now fights not just a Dark Lord, but the memory of a pale boy in a Slytherin tie, smiling politely as an acromantula is dragged away in chains. He knows exactly how narrowly Hogwarts avoided empowering Tom further, and that knowledge curdles into a quiet survivor's guilt. If Dumbledore had not believed him, if the board had yielded, the castle's history and Hagrid's identity would have been weaponized for Voldemort decades earlier. In closed-door meetings, Hagrid listens as the Ministry debates whether his background makes him a liability, while Dumbledore states with clinical calm that Hagrid can withstand curses most auras cannot. The dynamic is almost ironic. The institution that once nearly expelled him now relies on his loyalty, yet refuses to name him what he is, a frontline wizard. The turning point arrives during a raid on a safe house outside Godric's Hollow. Night. Rain. A family in the cellar. Death Eaters breach the hedgerow. Hagrid meets them in the garden, wand raised, earth shaking under his boots. Spells collide, Cruciatus slamming into his shields, his counter-curses hurling masked figures back through stone walls. And then the air goes cold. Voldemort steps through the smoke. For a heartbeat, they simply look at one another. Recognition flashes. The half-giant who survived expulsion. The prefect who failed to make his lie permanent. Hagrid's wand tightens in his hand. Voldemort's eyes narrow, calculating whether to erase this inconvenient witness now. He doesn't. A message from a snake, a prophecy to chase, a cottage in the village nearby. Voldemort disapparates with a snap, leaving only silence, rubble, and Hagrid's unanswered question hanging in the rain. Because when the Dark Lord returns from Godric's Hollow without a body, the man waiting at Hogwarts' gates for an orphaned boy is no longer merely a gentle guide. He is a soldier who almost faced his old accuser and knows that next time there will be no interruption. And when Harry arrives, that history changes everything. What if the storm-lashed hut on the rock didn't receive a hulking keeper of keys in a shaggy moleskin coat? What if, when the turning point arrives, the door gave way to a silhouette framed in one light and authority? Professor Rubeus Hagrid of Hogwarts School. The night is the same. Wind howls, rain needles the windows, Dudley whimpers on the sofa. But the man who slams the door off its hinges is wearing heavy, travel-worn Hogwarts robes, their hem dark with rain, and dragonhide boots, leaving measured prints on the stone. His beard is still wild, his hair still an untidy mane, yet the first thing Harry registers is not chaos. It is the crest on Hagrid's chest, glinting in the firelight, a lion, badger, eagle, and serpent surrounding a single word: Hogwarts. Canon gives us a gentle misfit hiding half his magic in a pink umbrella. Here, the core issue is mechanical. Hagrid does not need concealment. His wand is whole, holstered at his belt like any other professor's, and when he points it, the flames in the grate roar obediently higher, drying his robes in a precise ring of heat that never touches Harry. Power is not implied, it is demonstrated, cleanly, almost casually. Vernon Dursley, who in another reality tries to shout down a oaf, freezes at a different word entirely. "Professor," Hagrid rumbles, presenting the letter. The psychological fracture in Vernon is immediate and visible. This isn't a groundsman he can bully or bribe. This is an institutional representative, a man who examines, grades, and reports to a headmaster whose signature sits at the bottom of official parchment. The dynamic in the room inverts in a single breath. Hagrid still stumbles over his sentences, still misjudges the size of the furniture, but there is a quiet structure beneath the bluster now. He explains muggleborns and half-bloods with the practiced cadence of someone who has done this for terrified parents before. When he says, "Harry, you're a wizard," it lands not as a wild revelation from a stranger on the margins, but as a formal confirmation from the first adult wizard Harry has ever met. Imagine the psychological fracture inside Harry himself. He has known only two models of adulthood: petty cruelty and anxious compliance. Now, in the doorway stands a third option, someone enormous and gentle, yet visibly, undeniably capable. Hagrid is not the exception that proves Harry's unworthiness. He is proof that magic can coexist with warmth, with loyalty, with a kind of grounded strength Harry has never seen directed at him. The subtext is brutal when Hagrid's gaze tracks the room. He sees the too small clothes, the thinness, the mattress on the floor. His eyes flick to the cupboard door with too many bolts. In canon, he is indignant but uncertain, half expecting to be blamed. Here, we deconstruct a timeline where his full authority is intact. "He's been sleeping in there?" he asks, voice low, but his wand is already out, quietly expanding Harry's trunk, vanishing broken toys into splinters of harmless light. Vernon blusters about our house and our rules. This time, Hagrid does not simply growl, he cites law, educational decrees. Hogwarts' duty of care, Dumbledore's name, not as a distant legend, but as a headmaster who will read Hagrid's report in the morning. The threat is not violence, it is exposure. Vernon understands this language. He falls silent. Harry watches all of it. His first lesson in magic is not a birthday cake or a tale on Dudley, but an adult wizard drawing a line and holding it. In this hut on the rock, identity begins to shift. Harry does not just leave as the boy who lived. He leaves as the boy who has, for the first time, seen a professor choose him. And that choice will echo when he walks through the castle doors and sees who is waiting at the staff table. Diagon Alley in this timeline is not the chaotic rescue mission of a half-banned groundskeeper. It is a procession led by a professor who knows exactly where he stands in the magical hierarchy. The boat to the mainland is the same. The leaky cauldron is the same. But the dynamic when they walk through the door is fundamentally altered. Tom the barman does not blink and stammer over Harry Potter. He looks past the scar, nods with professional deference and says, "Morning, Professor Hagrid. Got the boy then?" The title lands in Harry's ears like a spell. It reframes everything that happened in the hut on the rock. Hagrid is not just a friendly giant, he is institutional power. At Gringotts, the difference becomes structural. In canon, Hagrid is clumsy, anxious about dragons, and visibly out of his depth. Here we deconstruct a timeline where he has sat in ministry briefings, read goblin treaties, and escorted students on official business for years. He greets the first goblin in formal gobbledygook, presents Dumbledore's key with a wand flick that layers a discreet protective charm over Harry's pocket, and signs the visitor ledger with the practiced hand of someone who has done this many times before. The core issue is mechanical. Harry learns, silently, that this man is trusted with more than fetching the boy. Goblins respond to power and protocol. They do not smile, but they do not sneer. One, recognizing Hagrid from a previous negotiation over Dragon Egg import law, inclines his head. The subtext is brutal for anyone paying attention. The half-giant the Ministry once eyed as a security risk is now a vetted participant in high-level banking arrangements. Harry, who has only ever seen adults weaponize authority against him, watches that authority deployed in his defense. On the cobbles of Diagon Alley, the social recalibration continues. Shopkeepers call out, "Professor Hagrid!" A Ravenclaw third year, arms full of books, nearly trips in her hurry to wave. Even the more aristocratic witches, the type who would usually whisper about giant blood, hesitate. They see the Hogwarts robes, the wand at his belt, the easy way he trades professional gossip with Madame Malkin about next year's uniform enchantments. Prejudice does not vanish, but it is forced to negotiate with reality. Ollivanders becomes the quiet heart of this sequence. Hagrid does not hover at the door like an ashamed intruder. He steps inside with the familiarity of a former customer and current colleague. Ollivander's pale eyes flick from Harry to Hagrid, and there is a moment where history hums in the dust. They speak of wandwoods and cores as peers, Ollivander recalling the oak wand that once chose Hagrid. Hagrid asking, with a teacher's curiosity, whether Phoenix Feather still trends toward noble but temperamental loyalties. Harry listens. He hears one law discussed not as mystical destiny, but as a craft, a structure with rules and consequences. Imagine the psychological fracture for a boy who has been told he is a freak. Now, even his freakishness is being integrated into a system that his giant companion clearly understands. Yet the whispers are still there, a pair of witches at flourish and blots, pretending to browse, murmur about giants and Azkaban and what the Ministry used to say. Harry clocks it. He also clocks the way their voices drop when Hagrid turns, the way they perform politeness because his competence has made open contempt dangerous. It is his first tangible lesson that identity in this world is negotiated between prejudice and proof. The turning point arrives over ice cream. They sit at Florian Fortescue's, sunlight on marble tables, Harry's pockets heavy with schoolbooks and a wand that has chosen him. Hagrid, more educated and more aware than his canon counterpart, watches him with a complicated expression. He begins, "There's things you ought to know about how Hogwarts got the way it is. About a boy named Tom Riddle." He stops. The trauma in that name, in this version of events, is not just personal disgrace, but an unresolved investigation, a war that never properly ended. Hagrid swallows the story, tells himself he'll explain when Harry is ready, and changes the subject to Quidditch. For the audience, the silence is louder than any confession. If Hagrid is this competent, this trusted, what could Tom Riddle possibly have done that still makes him hesitate? And when Harry finally reaches the castle, whose version of that story will get to him first? The answer arrives before Harry ever sees the Sorting Hat. On the train, Hagrid's goodbye is not a bumbling wave from the platform. It is a deliberate professorial send-off. He crouches to Harry's eye level, cloak smelling faintly of smoke and forest, and he does not talk about glory. He talks about decency, about the power of noticing beings the rest of the world writes off. Bravery's grand, he tells him, but it's how ye treat creatures and people no one else bothers with that shows what you really are. The line lands. Quietly, but it lands. In canon, Harry goes to Hogwarts primed to chase his father's shadow and flee Dudley's. Here, he boards the train with a different psychological script. Courage, yes, but tethered to loyalty, to fairness, to an instinctive suspicion of elegant cruelty. Imagine the psychological fracture when that meets the house system, a structure that promises belonging while sorting children into archetypes. When the boats emerge from the darkness, the Great Hall resolves into a different reality. At the staff table, there is no hunched gamekeeper at the edge of the light. There is Professor Hagrid, full robes strained at the seams, seated between McGonagall and Flitwick. He laughs at something Flitwick charms into a shower of gold sparks, then, with a flick of his own wand, transfigures one of them into a tiny, harmless dragon that chases its tail above the first year's heads. The message is subtle but clear. This half-giant is not an embarrassment tucked away in a hut. He is part of the institutional core. The core issue is mechanical. Change Harry's first adult ally from marginalized outsider to respected professor, and you rewire the inputs the Sorting Hat reads. When the hat drops over his eyes, it does not just taste ambition and courage, it tastes the imprint of that train ride lecture. It senses his attraction to loyalty, to protecting the overlooked, to the strange magnetic pull of magical creatures that Hagrid has framed as worthy rather than monstrous. So Hufflepuff in this timeline is not a throwaway suggestion. It is a serious gravitational well. The hat turns it over, weighing the psychological dynamic. A boy who has known only neglect, offered a house that values loyalty and quiet, stubborn work. A boy who has just seen his first safe adult laughing with his colleagues under the Hufflepuff hourglass. But the fracture lines run in other directions. Harry's instant bond with Ron pulls him toward Gryffindor. His visceral recoil from Draco's casual contempt pushes him away from Slytherin. And under that, a quieter desire. To be near Hagrid yet not defined by him. The hat debates. Hufflepuff's warmth against Gryffindor's narrative of active resistance. Which identity will he choose to inhabit? The turning point arrives in a whisper we never hear. Harry still asks not to go where Draco went. He still leans consciously toward Gryffindor. Yet this time, the hesitation is longer. The subtext is brutal. He could have been a badger. He could have been Hagrid's child in house colours. He emerges to the same applause, sits at the same table, but the internal architecture has shifted. From night one, Harry is not only the brave one, he is the boy who almost belonged to the world Hagrid represents. And that almost will shape every choice that follows. The next morning, that almost becomes geography. It becomes architecture. Harry's emotional map of Hogwarts does not spiral outwards from a lonely four-poster and an intimidating Great Hall. It orients around a fenced paddock at the edge of the forest, where the grass is torn up by hooves and claw marks, and the air smells like wet dog, hay, and smoke. In canon, Hagrid's hut is an off-the-books refuge, a place Harry sneaks to when everything else feels hostile. But here, the core issue is mechanical. Hagrid is not a tolerated anomaly on the grounds. He is on the timetable. Care of Magical Creatures, Professor R. Hagrid, sits in neat ink between charms and transfiguration. The sanctuary is not contraband, it is sanctioned. We deconstruct a timeline in which Harry's first lesson after sorting is not McGonagall's stern lecture or Snape's corrosive interrogation, but Hagrid waiting by a low stone wall, roll of parchment in hand, hair tied back, trying very hard to look like he believes he belongs among the faculty. The class gathers, half curious, half nervous. Hagrid unrolls the parchment and there it is, a syllabus, units, safety rules, ministry classifications, a structure. He starts them with puffskines and measles, not with fanged horrors. 11-year-olds pass around soft, humming creatures that vibrate with contentment, watch a proud, overlarge Kneasel stalk between their legs, and choose whose lap to occupy. Hagrid talks about feeding, grooming, recognizing distress. He demonstrates a cushioning charm under a student's arm, wand movements crisp, incantation clean. No pink umbrella, a full legal wand that answers him with steady, controlled power. Imagine the psychological fracture for Harry, who has only known adults that either ignore him or weaponize him, when this half-giant bends down to his eye level and says, "No one gets hurt in my class. Creatures or kids. That's my job." The subtext is brutal. Someone has taken responsibility for his safety and written it into the curriculum. Hagrid's pedagogy is not subtle. He uses his own history like a blunt instrument. He tells them about creatures labelled monsters because they are big, or ugly, or difficult to understand. He does not name Tom Riddle yet, but he names the feeling of being feared on sight. "People will call you dangerous when what you are is misunderstood," he says, hand resting on the flank of a skittish hippogriff in a later lesson, drawing a line between talons and prejudice. 11-year-old Harry only half understands, but the association lodges. Monsters, marginalization, identity. The dynamic on the grounds shifts. In the original reality, Hagrid is mocked as incompetent. His class is a punchline. Here, the criticism is different. Some parents complain he moves too quickly from puffskeins to hippogriffs, that his ambition outpaces their comfort. Yet, when he casts a containment ward, it holds. When a creature bolts, his stunner is precise. The staff may debate his curriculum, but not his competence. And then the turning point arrives in miniature. After that first class, when the others drift away, Hagrid calls Harry back. Not to press contraband rock cakes on him, not yet with a photo album, but with the steady authority of a recognized professor. "Listen, Harry," he says, voice low, eyes searching his face with a concern that is both personal and institutional now. "This place, Hogwarts, it's your home. Properly. No one's sending you back where you weren't wanted. As long as I'm here, I'll make sure it stays that way." Harry walks back up to the castle with hay on his robes and a new axiom in his mind. The forest edge is not just danger, it is protection. That reorientation will matter when the war and the creatures start pressing in. The forest edge becomes a thesis. Danger and protection, wild magic and chosen loyalty, all braided together in the silhouette of one half-giant professor who never lost his wand. So when a dragon egg appears on Hagrid's table, the scene looks familiar. But the dynamic is altered at the root. A fully trained Hagrid does not coo over Norbert in a haze of ignorance. He recites, almost automatically, the Romanian longhorn breeding restrictions, the fireproofing charms required for containment, the fines for unlicensed hatching. He still wants the dragon. Of course he does. The trauma of being accused of loving the wrong creatures has only intensified his defiance. But now, the core issue is mechanical. He layers wards on his hut, carves a flame-venting channel into the earth, and, crucially, He watches the stranger in the pub with a duelist's eye. Quirrell's stutter, the way his fingers tighten on his tankard when dragons are mentioned, the faint, acrid scent of dark magic clinging to his robes, Hagrid notices. He does not confront him, he files it. Imagine the psychological fracture that forms when the boy once framed by Tom Riddle feels that same oily pattern of manipulation in a nervous defense professor. By the time Norbert is quietly routed to Charlie Weasley through official channels, Hagrid has already written a cautious, almost reluctant note to Dumbledore. Something's wrong around Quirrell. That same vigilance follows them into the Forbidden Forest. In canon, Hagrid carries a crossbow. Here he carries a wand he is not ashamed to draw. When the hooded figure bends over the unicorn, the reaction is instantaneous, trained, violent. A blinding hex detonates against the trees, silver light tearing the shadows. A shield charm flares between Harry and the thing on the forest floor. Fang is no longer the primary deterrent. Hagrid is. The creature flees, not just startled, but driven back by concentrated lawful power. Harry sees it. The reality of adult magic shifts for him in that moment. Wizards are not only distant, twinkling headmasters or sneering potions masters. They can also be massive, gentle men who stand in front of you and throw themselves between you and a predator that drinks life from the innocent. The subtext is brutal. This is what Tom Riddle tried to take from Hagrid, a place in the defensive structure of the world. Hagrid's unease around Quirrell becomes a low, constant hum. He does not have proof, only pattern recognition and a long memory of how charm can mask rot. We deconstruct a timeline where that instinct matters. Dumbledore, already suspicious, is less blindsided. The stone protections are checked, reinforced, recalibrated. And yet, the turning point arrives in almost the same shape. Dumbledore still leaves. Quirrell still moves. Harry still chooses the trapdoor. The difference is psychological. Harry descends knowing that Hagrid, who has seen institutional betrayal up close, believes he can do this. The three-headed dog they pass is not a reckless accident of Hagrid's affection for beasts. It is a calibrated guardian, trained under his direct supervision, part of a coherent defense rather than a chaotic gamble. At the end-of-year feast, the photo album lands in Harry's hands with a different weight. It is not a consolation prize from a man the system broke and then tucked away at the edge of the grounds. It is a deliberate act by a professor who stayed inside that system, teeth gritted, to protect children like the boy in the pictures. Harry does not just see his parents, he sees an adult who refused to leave, and that, quietly, rewrites what home at Hogwarts can mean when the next year's darkness begins to gather. Darkness does not fall on Hogwarts with a scream. It arrives as a sentence whispered in corridors. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. But this time, the echo it wakes is not a half-forgotten legend. It is a file in the headmaster's office and a memory in every older witch and wizard who remembers. Hagrid was questioned once and he never left. The dynamic shifts immediately. In canon, suspicion grows in a vacuum of information. Here, there is structure. There are ministry reports stamped with insufficient evidence, statements from Professors Dippet and Dumbledore, and a formal notation that Tom Riddle's allegations never progressed to conviction. When the message on the wall bleeds through the castle, the adults are not scrambling for a name. They already have one, underlined in red and officially cleared. Imagine the psychological fracture in the staff room as the rumours spread. Hagrid, now a seasoned Care of Magical Creatures professor, sits at the same table as McGonagall, Snape and Flitwick, listening to the word chamber hang in the air like a curse. He knows exactly which file they are all thinking of. He helped Dumbledore draft the appeal that kept him in school. That history does not vanish just because it ended in his favour. The core issue is mechanical. Cornelius Fudge is a weak minister who survives by appearing decisive. A half-giant professor with a controversial past is a political gift. Visible, narratively convenient, already familiar to the press. But Fudge is not walking into a moral blank space. He is walking into a paper trail that says the ministry failed to find the real culprit 50 years ago. To act against Hagrid now is to admit that failure and to weaponize it. Behind closed doors, the staff fracture along predictable, painful lines. Snape, precise and icily courteous, notes that Hagrid's presence has always been a calculated risk given public sentiment about giants. Some governors, emboldened by distance and fear, murmur that Hogwarts cannot afford such a liability when parents are already panicking. McGonagall's response is surgical. Decades of spotless record, documented bravery in the First War, eyewitness accounts of Hagrid hauling injured students from rubble, while others hesitated. Flitwick, voice small but unshakable, reminds them that Hagrid's dueling in the war was not theoretical. He shielded children with his own body when Death Eaters broke lines. For Hagrid, the trauma is older than any Auror badge. He is not afraid of expulsion now. He is a fully qualified professor with tenure-like protections and Dumbledore's explicit backing. He is afraid of Harry and the others, looking at him the way the school once looked at Tom Riddle, as a question mark in human form, proof that Hogwarts might have been wrong. His identity has been rebuilt on loyalty and protection. The idea that his very presence could endanger his students is a cruelty the subtext is brutal about. When Fudge finally arrives, flanked by Aurors whose wands are already in their hands, the turning point arrives in a corridor heavy with portraits pretending to sleep. He does not dare announce an arrest. Instead, he demands a temporary suspension pending investigation, language carefully engineered for headlines. Hagrid's gaze finds Harry, Ron, and Hermione in the shadows. In the original timeline, he tells them to follow the spiders and lets himself be taken. Here, he straightens to his full, intimidating height and says quietly, "For them, as much as for Fudge, this time, I'm not running." The question is, what does a cornered Hagrid do when he finally refuses to move? The answer, in this restructured reality, is that a cornered Hagrid walks toward the danger. He waits until Fudge and Lucius are forced to watch him, not as a compliant half-giant, but as a fully qualified professor reclaiming narrative control. Then he turns, not to the castle, but to the tree line. He tells Harry and Ron very calmly to fetch his cloak. If spiders hold answers, they are not going alone this time. The trek into the forest is no longer a secret mission of terrified second years. It is an escorted inquiry. Hagrid moves with a professional's confidence, wand in hand, every Lumos and Homenum Revelio crisp, controlled, and reminding Fudge that this is not the expelled boy he once scapegoated. The dynamic is reversed. The Ministry is following Hagrid now, not dragging him. When they reach Aragog's Hollow, the scene fractures into a three-way confrontation. Hagrid speaks first, and he does not use the babying tone of canon. He invokes old loyalty like a binding spell. He reminds Aragog of the crate under the bed, the meals smuggled from the kitchens, the desperate protection when the castle turned on them both. Then, with a steadiness earned from decades of trauma and survival, he asks the question he has carried since third year. What really happened the night Myrtle died? Here, the turning point arrives. Aragog, blind and ancient, is not merely a monster, he is a witness. He admits that he was smuggled out in haste, yes, but the timing was wrong. Tom Riddle came to Hagrid's dormitory with a story already prepared, fear already rehearsed. Aragog recalls the scent of that fear and describes it as wrong, too cold, too calculated, more performance than panic. We deconstruct a timeline in which the core issue is mechanical, who had access to the pipes, and who had a motive to weaponize them. Aragog explains that even the forest spiders avoided the plumbing that ran beneath the castle, that there was a monster in the pipes whose presence pressed against his instincts like a physical repulsion. Spiders, predators of the dark, would not go near it. Whatever hunted through those walls was older, deeper, and, crucially, obeyed a human command. Hagrid listens, but he also cross-examines. This is not the inarticulate giant of the original books. This is a professor who has spent years under Dumbledore's tutelage. He asks about dates, about whether Tom knew the route out of the castle, about who suggested Hagrid as the convenient culprit. The subtext is brutal. Hagrid is forcing his own past to testify against the boy who became Voldemort. Pattern interrupt. Instead of Hagrid being dragged to Azkaban, it is Fudge who walks back through the forest in silence, shaken. Between Aragog's testimony, Hagrid's pristine disciplinary file, and Dumbledore's long-held suspicions, the structure of the old lie collapses. In staff meetings, they no longer speak in euphemism. Tom Riddle is named formally as the likely heir of Slytherin. Imagine the psychological fracture this creates in the adult world. The Ministry must accept that the Dark Lord's origin was not a tragic mystery, but an ignored pattern. Fudge realizes that using Hagrid as a shield now would mean openly denying fresh, coherent evidence. Even he is not ready to wear that level of cowardice in daylight. For Harry and Ron, the power of this moment is subtler but no less profound. They watch a man who has always been ashamed of his past stand in the middle of the forest and have it publicly rewritten. Hagrid's identity shifts, from wrongly accused victim to central witness in the first case ever made against Tom Riddle. And as the castle absorbs this new narrative, the war they are walking toward gains a clearer, harsher outline. Because once you officially name the boy who opened the chamber, you cannot pretend the chamber is an isolated incident. The question becomes, how does Hogwarts defend itself when the enemy's blueprint is finally visible? What happens when the blueprint is visible and the monster moves again? What happens when the institution can no longer claim ignorance, yet children are still being taken beneath its flaws? In this timeline, we deconstruct a timeline where the second opening of the chamber is not a mystery. It is a recurrence. Ginny Weasley disappears. The walls bleed another message. Hogwarts goes into lockdown with a speed that betrays institutional memory. There is no convenient scapegoat this time, no half-giant marched to Azkaban for public relations. Instead, Hagrid is in the staff war room, broad shoulders hunched over a spread of castle schematics, arguing with McGonagall while Dumbledore's portrait watches, grave and silent. The core issue is mechanical. The staff can secure corridors, cancel Quidditch, herd students into the Great Hall, but they cannot reach the pipes. McGonagall counsels caution, the Ministry demands investigation, and Hagrid, who has already lived through the trauma of waiting while a basilisk stalked the castle, refuses the passive posture. He insists with a hoarse, dangerous calm that they cannot simply sit above ground while a child lies beneath. Harry arrives in that room not as a sneaking rule-breaker, but as a witness carrying data. Spiders flooding toward the forest, voices in the walls, Myrtle's bathroom as the geographic constant between decades. This time, when he lays the fragments out, he lays them at Hagrid's feet, and Hagrid, who remembers a rooster's sudden silence, the echo of scales in stone corridors, recognizes the pattern with a sick lurch. Imagine the psychological fracture of realizing that the nightmare you were cleared of is repeating on your watch. The descent into the chamber is no longer the solo odyssey of a 12-year-old. It is a two-person incursion. Hagrid blows the entrance in Myrtle's bathroom with a controlled reducto that rattles the tiles, then drops into the darkness first. One drawn. Lumos Maxima blooming from his raised hand, like a false sun. The tunnels feel smaller around him, the structure of the rock complaining under his weight, yet his presence turns the claustrophobia into a shielded corridor rather than a tomb. Fawkes still comes. The Sorting Hat still delivers the sword. But the dynamic of the basilisk fight is fundamentally altered. Hagrid knows how predators track. He bellows, hurls boulders with magically amplified strength, and casts blasting curses that fracture pillars and shower the chamber with dust, forcing the serpent to rely on smell instead of sight. He plants himself between Harry and the basilisk's gaze, taking stone-shattering strikes on conjured shields that flicker and crack, yet hold long enough for Harry to move. And then the turning point arrives. Tom Riddle's memory coalesces, not into a stranger, but into the boy who once tried to have Hagrid executed by policy. The subtext is brutal. Riddle smiles and remarks that if Hagrid had been properly expelled, properly broken, none of this would be happening. He frames Ginny's fading body as the interest on Hogwarts' failure to punish. Hagrid's guilt and rage collide in a single terrible moment of clarity. His identity as protector, professor, and former accused fuses around one simple priority. Harry survives. When Harry pulls the sword from the hat, it is Hagrid's massive hand that closes over Harry's for the first swing, guiding the arc toward the serpent's exposed mouth as Fawkes blinds it. The blade meets scale and memory and history at once. And above them, the castle has to reckon with a new reality. The boy who opened the chamber and the man he failed to frame are now facing each other directly. That confrontation will not stay buried underground. The confrontation in the chamber does not stay a whispered legend. It becomes headline material. By the end of the week, every breakfast table in Wizarding Britain is ringed with the same front page, a moving photograph of Tom Riddle's smug, 16-year-old face dissolving into the hooded spectre of Voldemort. The headline is not about a dangerous half-giant. It reads with calculated drama, Tom Riddle, model student turned Dark Lord, The Chamber Truth Revealed. Underneath, in smaller print, another name finally appears without suspicion. Rubeus Hagrid, Professor of Magical Creatures, Primary Witness. The Daily Prophet does what it always does. It chases power and spectacle. But for once, the spectacle aligns with accuracy. Reporters linger on Hagrid's halting description of the diary, on Harry's account of the basilisk, on the structural reality that Riddle was never the victim, only the architect. We deconstruct a timeline in which the public is forced to see Voldemort not as an inexplicable eruption of evil, but as a boy the system praised, protected, and promoted. Cornelius Fudge reads the same paper and feels the ground tilt. His first instinct, days earlier, had been to suspend Hagrid pending inquiry, a reflexive move to reassure anxious pureblood donors. Now he appears on the Prophet's inside pages, insisting that he personally oversaw the investigation that cleared Hagrid. The subtext is brutal. Wizarding families remember who sent auras to the gates and who had stood beside Hagrid in the chamber's aftermath. No amount of spin can erase that psychological ledger. The turning point arrives in a high, echoing ministry chamber. Hagrid stands not as a terrified third year or a barely tolerated gamekeeper, but as a robed professor, wand holstered openly at his belt. He speaks slowly, voice catching, about being framed by Riddle, about the trauma of losing his identity at 13, about the cost of ignoring Dumbledore's warnings because a charming orphan spoke better Latin. When he says, "Yare can't judge a man's loyalty by the size of his hands," the gallery actually laughs, dry, uncomfortable, aware of its own prejudice. From that hearing, the mechanical consequences begin. The core issue is mechanical. For decades, anti-giant policy has been written on the assumption that their kind are inherently volatile. Now, activist groups and progressive families hold up Hagrid as a living counterexample. Pamphlets circulate, half-giant, whole wizard. Committees are formed. The ministry, still deeply prejudiced in private, is forced to soften its public rhetoric to speak of individual assessment and integration frameworks rather than blanket bans. Imagine the psychological fracture inside old pureblood drawing rooms as children quote Hagrid's testimony back at their parents. Imagine the quiet power of a new narrative in which the first person officially cleared in the chamber affair is not a sleek Slytherin, but a man the establishment once threw away. And outside the ministry, as Hagrid exits into the atrium's polished light, that new narrative acquires an enemy. In the murmuring crowd, a hooded figure watches him with cold, measuring interest. A Death Eater recognizes that this half-giant is no longer merely Dumbledore's loyal servant. He is becoming a symbol, a structural threat to their ideology. Symbols can't be framed as easily as boys. They have to be broken. Someone in that moment quietly decides to try. The decision to try takes form on a bright September afternoon, in a paddock ringed by nervous fourth years and one very unimpressed hippogriff. Buckbeak bows, Harry bows, the class exhales. The lesson on paper is airtight. Written waivers, colour-coded risk tiers, a ministry-approved curriculum Hagrid has practically memorised. Decades of being blamed have produced an unusual result. He teaches wonder, but he documents liability. Then Draco steps forward. The canon moment remains. Arrogance, insult, a flash of talons, blood on the grass. But the dynamic is different. Before the panic can metastasize into legend, Hagrid's wand is out. Pain spells, stabilizing Draco's arm with clinical efficiency. He has 3 witnesses sign incident reports before Madame Pomfrey even arrives. The subtext is brutal. He knows exactly how this will be spun, and he is already building the counter-narrative. From there, we deconstruct a timeline that diverges not in emotion, but in structure. Hagrid does not retreat to his hut to drink and despair. He goes to McGonagall with a folder. Case law on hippogriff temperament. Prior ministry rulings on acceptable classroom risk. Written testimony from Kettleburn, from a dragon handler in Romania, from a Beaubaton Magi-zoologist who owes him a life debt. The core issue is mechanical. Lucius Malfoy intends to turn a boy's minor injury into a weaponized precedent. Hagrid intends to make that precedent dangerous to wield. Imagine the psychological fracture here. Hagrid is both empowered and haunted. He has his wand, his position, his competence, and still, in the quiet hours, he hears the echo of that first expulsion hearing that never happened. The ghost of a punishment he escaped, but never forgot. In his nightmares, it is not Buckbeak in chains. It is himself and every dangerous creature whose existence makes pure-blood parents uncomfortable. Harry, Ron, and Hermione feel that tension immediately. They still visit the hut, still drink tea at a table permanently too small for its owner, but the pedagogy has shifted. Hagrid walks them through the complaint process, explains how Lucius uses the Board of Governors as a pressure point, has Hermione draft mock arguments, and then tears them apart kindly but ruthlessly. When Dumbledore later entrusts Hermione with the Time Turner, Hagrid is the one who frames its power. Legal avenues first, temporal subversion only when the system proves itself structurally unjust. The hearing becomes the crucible. In canon, Hagrid is barely a participant in his own tragedy. Here he walks into that panel room in a too-tight suit, hands trembling, notes meticulously organized. The pattern interrupt arrives when he does not cry. Instead, he delivers a halting, profound speech about fear, about how much easier it is to break a beak than interrogate a bias, about what it means to live as a half-giant in a world that files you mentally beside your blast-ended scroots. He sways some of them. A junior official lowers her quill, visibly shaken. Even Fudge looks uncomfortable. But Lucius does not need consensus. He needs leverage. The sentence is delayed, not overturned. And as Harry and Hermione stand outside the office, clutching the Time Turner, they understand. They are no longer just saving a creature. They are stress-testing a system that may have to break entirely in the years to come. The Ministry hearing ends on parchment and protocol, but the real verdict is waiting on the Hogwarts Express. Dementors sliding past compartment doors are not an abstract political problem. They are a direct assault on children. This time, when the lamps flicker and the temperature drops, it is not only Lupin who rises. Hagrid, fully qualified, draws his wand with the reflex of someone who has actually revised for NEWT level defense. His Patronus is not elegant, more a bursting silvery shield than a proud animal. But he knows the theory, the psychological mechanics of anchoring memory against despair. He cannot outshine Lupin's wolf, but he can coordinate. As Lupin stabilizes Harry, Hagrid moves methodically down the corridor, booming instructions that are half battlefield order, half pastoral care. Stay in groups, keep your wands visible, focus on the warmest thing you can remember. The core issue is mechanical. If the Ministry will not protect them, the staff must construct their own defense structure. At the gates, the dynamic hardens into ritual. Hagrid meets each Dementor patrol with visible, grudging professionalism, wand in hand, half-giant bulk, an unsubtle reminder that Hogwarts is not passive territory. He and Lupin establish a rota, quiet check-ins after every Hogsmeade weekend, coded questions in staff meetings about incidents that never make it into Fudge's reports. Imagine the psychological fracture, a school meant to be sanctuary, ringed by creatures that feed on trauma. In that pressure cooker, Hagrid and Lupin gravitate toward each other almost inevitably. One carries a werewolf's curse, the other a half-giant stigma. Both know what it is to be the adult parents fear their children near. Their late-night conversations in Hagrid's hut are a study in parallel prejudice, Lupin describing locked doors and wolfsbane, Hagrid recalling how a boy named Tom Riddle weaponized fear of his bloodline. The subtext is brutal. They are trusted to guard children against monsters while being quietly filed under monstrous themselves. This alters the emotional physics after Harry's fall from his broom. Canonically, Hagrid offers tea and outrage. Here, he adds something closer to trauma counseling. He talks Harry through grounding techniques, naming objects in the room, focusing on the feel of Fang's fur, the crackle of the fire, before even mentioning Quidditch. Then, with Lupin's blessing, he introduces the first clumsy ideas of Patronus work. Not formal lessons, but a reframing of identity. You are not weak because you fell, you are human because you felt. And when Sirius Black finally emerges from the shadows of memory, we deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid's recollection of Godric's Hollow has been sharpened by years of disciplined, pensive work with Dumbledore. He remembers the angle of the blasted wall, the exact sequence of voices, the way Sirius's grief sounded less like guilt and more like someone whose reality had just been ripped away. So Hagrid is more suspicious of the supposed traitor, more protective of Harry, but also marginally more permeable when the truth bleeds through in the Shrieking Shack. The turning point arrives not in a single revelation, but in the slow, painful alignment of details he can no longer ignore. That is why, on the astronomy tower, when Buckbeak's wings beat against the storm and Sirius clings to a future measured in borrowed seconds, Hagrid does not hesitate. Wand raised, half-giant silhouette carved against the sky, he chooses justice over law for the second time in his life. He knows the system is already cracking. He has seen its fear at the hearing, its cruelty in Azkaban's shadows. As Hippogriff and Fugitive vanish into the night, Hagrid is left with a question that will haunt the coming war. If the guardians of children must routinely break the rules to keep them alive, what exactly is the law protecting? The law is cracking, and by the time the Beauxbatons carriage carves through the clouds and the Durmstrang ship claws its way out of the lake, Hagrid is no longer just the gentle groundskeeper watching it happen. He is Professor Hagrid, care of magical creatures, seated on the Triwizard organizing committee for anything that breathes fire, bites, or tramples. Visually, the dynamic is different from the moment the guests arrive. Hagrid does not lurk at the edge of the staff table. He occupies a defined position in the school's power structure, robes marked with the subtle insignia of a full professor. When Madame Maxime sweeps into the Great Hall, she is not merely clocking a fellow half-giant curiosity. She is assessing a colleague who helped design the tasks, a man Dumbledore clearly trusts with institutional authority and, beneath that, with the lives of children. Karkaroff, by contrast, cannot quite hide his unease. In canon, he dismisses Hagrid as an oaf. Here we deconstruct a timeline where the ex-Death Eater must navigate a half-giant whose wand work is respected, whose loyalty to Dumbledore and the Order-adjacent orbit is an open secret. The subtext is brutal. This is not a man you can bully or scapegoat without consequence. That new reality reshapes the first task. Dragons are still chosen, because of course they are, but Hagrid's role is not a backdoor informant. He is the architect of the creature component. He still walks Harry down to the enclosure, still pulls back the curtain on the Hungarian horntail. But he does not stop at, there you go. He begins to teach. In the shadow of iron chains and scorched earth, Hagrid runs Harry through advanced distraction spells, layering simple conjunctivitis curses with controlled noise charms to overload a dragon's senses without driving it berserk. He drills shield charms until Harry can raise a curved barrier that deflects flame rather than merely absorbing it. The core issue is mechanical. Harry must learn to buy 3 seconds of dragon hesitation and turn them into flight. More importantly, Hagrid explains psychology of dragons and of fear. He talks about how dragons under stress fixate on movement, how they test boundaries, how their rage is predictable if you respect their trauma. Harry walks into the arena less as bait and more as a novice handler executing a plan. The spectacle remains lethal. The margin for survival is wider. Outside the arena, the question of identity sharpens. When Hagrid and Maxime walk in the frosted gardens, he does not mumble through his heritage. He speaks from hard-won pride, a man who finished Hogwarts under suspicion and still claimed his place. When she denies her size, he challenges her gently but directly. What has the world done to you that you must fracture yourself to feel safe? Imagine the psychological fracture in that moment, not only hers but his, refusing to retreat into shame. That conversation echoes into the giant mission later, but it also sends a quieter signal to every foreign student watching. Hogwarts employs a half-giant professor and trusts him with dragons. That is a political statement disguised as curriculum. And in the graveyard, when Voldemort rises and the masks close in, that statement is not forgotten. Among the murmured inventory of threats, Dumbledore, the Auras, the Order, one Death Eater leans in and hisses a new name that did not matter in the original timeline: the half-giant professor. Voldemort pauses, recalibrating. Hagrid is no longer background. He is a variable to be neutralized. The next move in the war will be planned with Hagrid in mind. Order headquarters recalibrates as well. In the dim kitchen of Grimmauld Place, Hagrid is not the oversized guest hunched at the end of the table. He is seated near the maps, sleeves rolled up, voice cutting through the low roar of strategy. When Dumbledore outlines the mission to the Giants, it is not a half-secret exile, but a formal assignment. Professor Rubeus Hagrid, care of magical creatures, acting as Hogwarts and Order envoy, Armed with parchments bearing Dumbledore's seal and ministry loopholes, Kingsley has quietly prepared. The core issue is mechanical. In canon, Hagrid is sent underprepared into a collapsing giant hierarchy, relying on raw loyalty and vague instructions. Here, we deconstruct a timeline where his full education has consequences. He walks into the mountains with reinforced translation charms, structured diplomacy protocols, and a tiered set of backup plans. Secure apparition points, pre-arranged Patronus codes, even a covert retrieval window led by Tonks if negotiations fail. Around the Grimmauld table, that change in competence shifts the entire dynamic. Moody growls about acceptable risk. Hagrid pushes back, pointing out the psychological reality of treating giants only as weapons or enemies. Kingsley counters with casualty projections. Hagrid responds with field reports, centaur patrol patterns in the forest, rumors from werewolf packs, whispers carried by owls and thestrals. He is coordinating creature-related intelligence as systematically as any aura, and the subtext is brutal. The half-giant who once swept floors is now arguing operational doctrine with the Ministry's best. But power brings a quieter fracture. Between missions, we see him back at Hogwarts, chalk dust on his hands, patiently guiding fourth years through controlled hippogriff interactions, then vanishing through a flue grate the moment the bell rings. He is grading essays on blast-ended scroot ecology at 2 a.m, eyes red, when an order message flares above his desk. Imagine the psychological fracture of realizing that every success simply earns you a more dangerous assignment. That tension crystallizes around Grawp. In the original timeline, Grawp is a desperate secret wedged into the forest. Here, Hagrid frames him as an experiment in cross-cultural contact. He drafts observation logs, requests a charmed perimeter from Flitwick, even persuades a wary McGonagall to review his proposed curriculum of language, gesture, and basic boundaries. It is still risky, but it is risk inside a structure, not chaos masquerading as hope. Pattern interrupt. Harry does not experience Hagrid as the endlessly available refuge in a hut at the forest's edge. He experiences him half asleep at the staff table, snapping awake when a first year spills pumpkin juice, then wincing as an owl drops yet another coded summons into his porridge. For the first time, Harry watches Hagrid hesitate before leaving, eyes flicking from the students to the door, and understands that adult loyalty can be a kind of self-harm. The turning point arrives when Hagrid finally asks Dumbledore in a low, steady voice whether his height and resilience have made him too easy to spend. Dumbledore does not answer immediately. The silence lingers into the next phase of the war, where the question of who gets spent and where is about to define everything. That unanswered question follows Hagrid into the pink, suffocating reality of Dolores Umbridge's regime. The man who once wondered if he was too easy to spend now watches the Ministry try to cash him in as a symbol, then erase him altogether. Her first inspection of care of magical creatures is not comic relief. It is theatre. Umbridge steps into the paddock in her cardigan armour, clipboard raised, to confront not a bumbling gamekeeper with an umbrella, but a fully robed, tenured professor whose presence advertises Dumbledore's inclusive vision every time he lifts his wand. The class is studying hippogriffs. Buckbeak's wings flare against a grey sky as if underlining the tension. In canon, she needles Hagrid's grammar and pretends not to understand his lessons. Here, the core issue is mechanical. She cannot plausibly call him incompetent. His syllabus cites Ministry-approved best practices. His wand work is clean. His NEWT results are on file. When she questions the academic rigour of his curriculum, Hagrid quietly produces the very care of magical creatures guidelines she helped draft, complete with her initials in the margin. The subtext is brutal. The Ministry's own structure now protects a half-giant it wishes it could disown. We deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid has read the rulebook cover to cover. In front of a ring of silent students, he asks in that same low, steady voice he once used with Dumbledore, which educational decree supersedes the Ministry's own safety regulations on creature handling. He quotes clause numbers. He points out that her demand to remove potentially dangerous beasts would invalidate half the subject. For a moment, the power dynamic glitches. Her authority is suddenly procedural, not divine, so she adapts. If she cannot win on competence, she will win on blood. Behind closed doors and in carefully phrased letters to worried parents, she begins to whisper about half-breeds and unpredictable impulses. She does not say Hagrid's name at first. She does not need to. Imagine the psychological fracture for students who have watched this man heal a hippogriff's wing and a homesick first year in the same afternoon, now hearing that his very identity is a safety risk. Dumbledore's army, already born from institutional failure, responds on instinct. They pack his lessons. They organize informal study circles to review his notes, ensuring that any attempt to downgrade the course for low enrollment looks transparently manufactured. Hermione drafts meticulous letters to the Board of Governors, citing exam scores and incident reports. Harry and Ron tell anyone who will listen that they would rather stand next to Hagrid in the Forbidden Forest than next to Umbridge in a corridor. The turning point arrives during a staff meeting that feels more like a trial. Umbridge challenges Hagrid's objectivity with dangerous creatures. Hagrid counters with a decade of spotless records and a reminder that giants fought on both sides in the last war. There is a silence, thick and brittle. Then Umbridge smiles, a thin, bureaucratic curve, and informs him that his position will be undergoing a formal review. Later, in his office, the fire burns low. The castle seems to be holding its breath. On Umbridge's desk, miles away in the High Inquisitor's sanctum, a blank parchment lies open. Ink begins to crawl across it, forming the title of a new educational decree, one aimed very precisely at non-human staff. The decree writes itself in Umbridge's spidery hand, but the reality it attempts to impose is far less stable. On parchment, non-human staff can be categorized, contained, erased. In the corridors, however, a fully trained half-giant with a wand and tenure is not a line item. He is a structural problem. The core issue is mechanical. Umbridge's power depends on fear, surveillance, and the quiet humiliation of anyone who might become a symbol. Hagrid, in this timeline, is already a symbol. The boy who was vindicated when Riddle fell, the professor who never broke under 2 wars' worth of prejudice. So when educational decrees begin to metastasize, he does not simply grumble in his hut. He starts to coordinate. We deconstruct a timeline where the swamp in the 5th floor corridor and the blazing Catherine wheels over Umbridge's head are not just adolescent chaos, but synchronized cover fire. Fred and George bring him prototypes, miniature dragons that explode into shrieking phoenixes, fireworks that mimic Patronus signatures, and Hagrid, with a grim, almost academic focus, helps them time the detonations to Umbridge's inspections of his own lessons and those of other sympathetic staff. Imagine the psychological fracture for a High Inquisitor who keeps arriving to classrooms wreathed in sanctioned pandemonium, unable to prove intent, only impact. Parallel to the spectacle runs the quiet architecture of resistance. Hagrid's paddock, already a liminal space between castle and forest, becomes the shell for Dumbledore's army. He borrows an unused stone outbuilding near the edge of the grounds, registers it on the timetable as auxiliary creature housing, and then overlays it with layered wards, muffling charms to blur spell signatures, misdirection fields that nudge patrolling inquisitorial squad members 2 degrees off course. To the Ministry, it reads as a professor expanding his practical curriculum. To Harry, it is a fortress. In that dim, hay-scented room, another dynamic shifts. After one particularly tense DA session, when Harry's anger crackles louder than the spells, Hagrid closes the door and, for once, does not deflect with tea. He talks about leadership as a form of trauma management, about Dumbledore's habit of swallowing the entire war and calling it strategy. "You're not him," he tells Harry, voice low. "Don't make yourself a tower no one can reach." The subtext is brutal. Hagrid has watched one great man break under the weight of solitary command. He refuses to watch a boy do the same. When the Ministry finally comes to remove him, they expect the Gamekeeper of canon, not the duelist Dumbledore trained. Wands are drawn in the moonlit yard. Hagrid answers with non-lethal concussive force, blasting officials off their feet, shielding nearby Gryffindors behind invisible walls of compressed air. It is not clean. It is not pretty. But no student is harmed. Here, the turning point arrives. In canon, Hagrid's disappearance into the forest leaves a vacuum. In this reality, he refuses exile. Bloodied, reprimanded, technically suspended, he continues to walk the grounds in plain sight, a battered standard of resistance. Every glimpse of his massive silhouette against the tree line tells the students a simple, incendiary truth. The castle is not yet fully theirs. Pattern interrupt. The half-giant they were taught to fear has become the safest landmark in Hogwarts. And Umbridge, watching from her window, understands that as long as Hagrid remains visible, her victory is cosmetic. The next escalation will not be written on parchment. By the time we reach the year of the Half-Blood Prince, Hagrid's silhouette against the tree line means something very different. It is no longer a quiet protest against Ministry overreach. It is a structural pillar in Dumbledore's final defensive design. At the staff table, the dynamic shifts the moment Horace Slughorn returns. In canon, Slughorn drifts back into place as the avuncular collector, and Hagrid is the tolerated eccentric at the margins. But here, with a fully qualified Professor Hagrid already embedded, the power geometry is altered. Slughorn's old Slytherin network reforms around the platters of steak and kidney pie, students and alumni orbiting him like satellites. Hagrid watches, massive and silent, noting which pureblood parents are named, which ministry careers are praised, which silences feel deliberate. The subtext is brutal, influence masquerading as hospitality. We deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid is not socially blind to that reality. Years of seeing the ministry scapegoat giants, werewolves, and himself have honed a wary literacy. When Slughorn laughs a little too loudly at a joke about dangerous bloodlines, Hagrid's eyes flick down the table to Dumbledore. No words, just a shared recognition that the old Slytherin patronage machine is humming again. In response, Dumbledore does something he could never quite do in canon. He weaponizes Hagrid's competence. The core issue is mechanical. Hogwarts needs layered, practical magic on its borders, wards that understand the Forbidden Forest as a living perimeter, not a blank on a map. Hagrid spends evenings with Flitwick and McGonagall, his huge hands surprisingly precise as he traces runic anchors into the soil, reinforcing anti-apparition lines, beast-sensing alarms, and anti-disillusionment nets along the game trails only he truly knows. Imagine the psychological fracture for any intruder who slips past ministry standard protections, only to discover the ground itself has been taught Hagrid's instincts. Against that backdrop, Draco Malfoy becomes a moving anomaly. Hagrid sees him more than once, pale and tight-jawed at the forest's edge, staring into the trees as if they might swallow his obligations. Hagrid recognizes the gait. It is the walk of someone carrying a task too heavy for his frame, a boy pressed between ideology and survival. He debates, internally, relentlessly, whether to confront Draco directly, to drag him into the hut for tea and blunt questions, or to carry his suspicions to Dumbledore and become, once again, the witness who names a Slytherin heir. Loyalty pulls in two directions, to Dumbledore's larger strategy and to the simple, stubborn belief that children should not be weapons. Then Aragog dies, and the fracture widens. The funeral still happens. Moonlight on the clearing, Slughorn's lanterns swinging, Harry half-dazed by Felix Felicis. But Hagrid, now versed in memory charms, legilimency theory, and the politics of testimony, is not oblivious to the performance. Slughorn's evasions around old times and promising students land differently when you have read case law on altered memories. Hagrid's grief for Aragog is real, raw, but beneath it runs a second current. Unease at how effortlessly Slughorn steers Harry toward confession while dodging his own. Later, when Hagrid hears Dumbledore has extracted the crucial Horcrux memory, he understands both the victory and the cost. The boy he has guarded since a hut on a rock has been maneuvered again by adult agendas. And then the Tower Knight arrives. The wards Hagrid helped weave shudder under coordinated assault. He feels it in the ground before the alarms sound. While Death Eaters slip through the vanishing cabinet, others test the perimeter, and Hagrid is in motion, bellowing warnings, hurling stunners that crack like thunder, physically interposing his body between fleeing first years and masked figures. His magic is not elegant, but it is decisive. Earth shield charms that rise like embankments, fire-quenching jets that smother cursed flames, a transfigured fallen tree that becomes a barricade across the courtyard. He fights his way inward, not outward, following the trail of chaos up through the castle. On the moving staircases, he duels two Death Eaters at once, his wand amplifying the raw power that once lived only in his fists. A shield charm, broad and domed, absorbs a volley of hexes meant for a cluster of Ravenclaws frozen in panic. He roars at them to run. They do. By the time he reaches the base of the astronomy tower, the structure of the night has already been decided. The stairwell is choked with smoke and rubble, wards half collapsed by dark magic from above. Hagrid forces his way up several flights, lungs burning, coat smouldering, until a sudden stillness falls. From the open archway far above, a single, unnatural green flare paints the stone. He stops. Not by choice, but because reality has just been rewritten. Hagrid does not see the curse leave Snape's wand, but he sees the fall. He reaches a shattered window in time to watch Dumbledore's body arc outward, a tiny, robed shape against the night, and crash onto the courtyard stones he helped fortify. The protective structure he built has held against invaders, but it cannot hold back fate. Imagine the psychological fracture in that moment. The man who trusted his strength lies broken inside the very walls Hagrid reinforced. Loyalty for Hagrid has always been physical, carrying Harry, shielding students, standing in doorways until the danger passes. Now it becomes something harsher. He understands that he was not simply Dumbledore's gamekeeper or his colleague. He was part of the man's last line of defense, and he was still one flight of stairs too low. As the Death Eaters retreat and the dark mark hangs over the tower, Hagrid drags stunned students behind the ramparts, his hands shaking in a way they never did in battle. The turning point arrives not with a speech, but with a quiet internal verdict. If Dumbledore's war is to continue, Hagrid's role can no longer be reactive. The half-giant who once watched from the forest's edge will have to step into the center of the coming siege. Because the next time the castle is tested, there will be no higher authority to defer to, only the choices of those who remain. The turning point arrives on a quiet afternoon at the Burrow, at a table that feels more like a war room than a kitchen. In canon, Hagrid is simply told what to do. But in this reality, with a full education and a professor's authority, he is one of the few people in the room Dumbledore would once have called a peer. They spread the map of Britain between the teacups. Kingsley outlines the decoy plan. Moody growls about polyjuice rotations, and then Hagrid, very calmly, says they are underestimating Muggle geography. He traces motorways with a blunt finger, explaining slip roads, service stations, underpasses, concrete corridors Voldemort's followers barely understand. The core issue is mechanical. Brooms and thestrals are predictable vectors. A flying motorbike that can vanish into motorway airspace is not. He refuses to be just a driver. When Moody suggests he focus on keeping Potter on the seat, Hagrid pushes back with an uncharacteristic precision. The motorbike is restructured like a mobile fortress. Layered shield charms etched into the chassis. A reinforced sidecar with goblin-wrought bracing. A self-correcting stabilizing charm keyed to Hagrid's wand. It is in effect a one-vehicle phalanx designed by a half-giant who has spent decades watching how people die. Night falls on Privet Drive. The psychological dynamic is familiar. Goodbyes, tension, the quiet trauma of Harry leaving the only home he ever hated. But the man waiting at the curb is different. Robes battle-scarred, wand in hand rather than hidden in an umbrella, Hagrid radiates a contained, intimidating power. Harry notices the way Tonks and Kingsley defer to him, the way Moody does not bark, only grunts assent. When the ambush detonates around them, curses cutting through the clouds, green and red fracturing the sky, Hagrid does not flail. He drives one-handed, the other arm casting a rotating sequence of Protego variants that slam into incoming spells with visible force. Shield after shield blooms around the bike, overlapping planes of blue-white light. Where Canon Hagrid absorbed curses with his body, this Hagrid tanks them with deliberate, trained spellwork, his giant-born magical reserves turning him into a moving bulwark. Harry, pressed low in the sidecar, watches as Hagrid snaps off stunners and blasting curses between gear shifts, using the bike's roar to mask the timing of his spells. Imagine the psychological fracture, the man who once fumbled with a pink umbrella, now executing textbook combat geometry at 70 miles an hour. Harry's image of him, big and kind, slightly bumbling, shatters into a new identity category entirely: Commander. Then Voldemort arrives. In canon, panic and gravity do the work. Here, Hagrid understands immediately. Twin phoenix feather cores, wand against wand, create a lethal symmetry. He has heard Dumbledore's analysis, he has taught Harry the theory. The subtext is brutal. If Harry engages directly, the sky becomes a ritual circle and Voldemort controls the terms. So Hagrid does something quietly brilliant. He cuts the bike hard beneath a bank of cloud, deliberately breaking line of sight, using Muggle traffic below as a living shield Voldemort will hesitate to blast through. He layers a diffraction charm over the exhaust, scattering their magical signature. It almost works. The curse that finally hits them is not elegant. It is brute force. Metal screams, wards overload, and the bike plummets. But even in freefall, Hagrid is casting bleeding power into a cushioning lattice that saves Harry's spine at the cost of his own. They hit the ground in a ruin of earth and twisted steel. Hagrid is breathing, but barely. Ribs crushed, wand splintered, giant physiology working against him as much as for him. Harry drags him toward the hedgerow, hands slipping on blood and oil, mind catching up to a single horrifying realization. If Hagrid dies here, the educated Hagrid, the professor, the strategist, then the timeline we've been deconstructing collapses into irony. All that reclaimed dignity, all that restructured power, extinguished in the same narrative beat the original story used for chaos. And somewhere above them, unseen, another presence moves, drawn to the fracture in the night. The presence is not a Death Eater, it is the regime itself. By the time the Carrows arrive, Hogwarts is not a school. It is an occupied fortress wearing a school's skin. Classrooms become laboratories for sanctioned cruelty. Dark arts is taught openly as a discipline of domination, and detentions end, not with lines, but with cruciatus. The subtext is brutal. Obedience is the only passing grade. Within that structure, Hagrid is quietly strangled. The Ministry decrees that care of magical creatures is to be heavily supervised, which in practice means slashed lesson time, banned species, and Carrow observers who treat every Kneasel like a potential insurgent. But Hagrid adapts. Every permitted class becomes a subversive seminar in ethics and survival. How to heal a burned hippogriff wing doubles as battlefield triage. Recognizing acromantula web patterns becomes an exercise in reading ambush terrain. Discussions about loyalty in pack creatures slide almost imperceptibly into questions about moral courage under occupation. This is where we deconstruct a timeline. In canon, Hagrid is pushed to the margins during this year, a tragic background figure. Here, the core issue is mechanical. He has a wand, training, and tenure. He cannot be easily dismissed, so the regime must tolerate his presence, even as they underestimate his influence. That miscalculation becomes its own quiet rebellion. Beyond the walls, the forest changes identity. What was once framed as a place of childish dares and narrative punishment becomes, under Hagrid's hand, an underground transit system. He negotiates with the centaurs on equal terms, not as a supplicant but as a colleague who understands their trauma and pride. Safe paths are mapped by starlight and hoofprint, routes that can move a hunted Muggleborn from the castle edge to centaur territory without crossing a single Carrow patrol. Even the acromantulas are woven into the network. Hagrid cannot make them gentle, but he can make them predictable. Certain web spirals signal no prey tonight, a crude ceasefire that allows terrified third years to slip past if they follow his instructions precisely. Messages ride on Owl, on Centaur, and occasionally in the hollow of a blast-ended Scroot crate destined for Hogsmeade. It is messy, dangerous magic as logistics, but it works. And over all this hovers Severus Snape. Their dynamic is a study in misread loyalty. Hagrid does not know Snape is on their side. He only knows that some orders arrive late, softened, or with deliberate loopholes. Snape bans evening excursions, but the ban arrives after Hagrid has already scheduled mandatory night feeding rotations for 6th years. When the Carrows demand a list of troublesome students, Snape insists it come through him, and Hagrid responds with a document so over-inclusive, half of Gryffindor and most of Hufflepuff, that it becomes useless as a targeting tool. Imagine the psychological fracture in those moments. To the staff, Snape is executioner. To Hagrid, he is a flawed shield, failing loudly in ways that accidentally protect children. Hagrid pushes back publicly, arguing over punishments, refusing to hand over first years, giving Snape plausible cover to appear harsh while quietly commuting sentences. Their arguments are real. The outcomes are not. When first years are threatened directly, the mask drops. Hagrid stands between a sobbing child and Amicus Carrow, half-giant bulk and wand raised, offering himself as the more satisfying target. Detentions that should have gone to 11-year-olds are diverted to him. Nights that should have ended in the dungeons end in Hagrid's hut, where shaking hands wrap around mugs of tea while he mutters grounding charms under his breath. Here, the turning point arrives. Hagrid is no longer the lovable outlier at the edge of the narrative. He becomes one of its central pillars of resistance, the adult analogue to Neville's underground student leadership. If Neville is the face of the rebellion in the common rooms, Hagrid is its spine in the corridors and on the grounds. Pattern interrupt. Imagine walking the Battle of Hogwarts without him. The entire geometry of that night changes. And as the war tightens, the question is no longer whether Hagrid will survive, but what his survival allows everyone else to become. So when the protective enchantments finally scream and Voldemort's army floods the grounds, we are not watching a gentle gamekeeper swept along by history. We are watching the man who has been quietly designing this battlefield for years step into the role it has carved into him. The opening moves are not chaos, they are choreography. From the ramparts, Hagrid's voice booms through the din, not panicked but issuing pre-arranged commands. Hippogriffs launch from the towers in disciplined formations, diving as aerial cavalry to harry broom-riding Death Eaters and peel them away from the castle windows. Thestrals, invisible to most of the students they're defending, move as a stealth strike force along the tree line, dropping riders behind enemy lines. In the Forbidden Forest, centaurs coordinate with Hagrid's signals, their arrows forming a moving wall that shapes the charge rather than merely resisting it. The core issue is mechanical. Hagrid has spent an adult lifetime mapping the grounds, cataloguing creature temperaments, and drilling them like unconventional regiments. This isn't let the beasts run wild and hope for the best. It is combined arms strategy, translated into the language of magic and instinct. The dynamic between castle, forest, and sky becomes a living structure he can manipulate. And then he moves. Fully trained, wand in hand rather than hidden in an umbrella, Hagrid becomes a mobile fortress at the main courtyard choke point. Area spells roar from him. Wide-impact shield charms that dome entire stairwells. Earth-shaking transfigurations that heave the flagstones into jagged barricades or swallow advancing ranks in sudden trenches. When those spells are not enough, he simply uses his body, catching a blasting curse on layered wards and driving a Death Eater into a wall with a single, brutal punch. We deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid is not merely present at the Battle of Hogwarts, but visibly altering its casualty map. He drags a crushed Ravenclaw out from under a collapsed archway with one hand while his other maintains a shimmering barrier against falling debris. He intercepts a streak of green aimed at a cluster of first years, his shield flaring and cracking but holding long enough for Professor Sprout to yank them behind cover. Colin Creevey, who in canon never makes it to morning, is here pulled back over the threshold of the castle, Hagrid's huge arm braced against the door as curses hammer the stone. When Voldemort's giants finally lumber into view, canon expects Hagrid to be a symbolic counterpoint. But in this reality, he walks forward as a trained negotiator and warrior, projecting his voice in their own harsh tongue. For a moment, the battle hesitates. He names their old grievances, the betrayals by wizards on both sides, and offers them a different identity. Not weapons, but witnesses. A few waver, one even turns its club aside. The subtext is brutal. Those who stay with Voldemort do so in full awareness of the choice. The turning point arrives when the killing slows and Voldemort calls his truce. As bodies are gathered, Hagrid stands in the ruined courtyard, bloodied, burned, but unbowed, framed by hippogriffs circling overhead and centaurs still knocking arrows in the distance. He is a living refutation of every word Voldemort is about to speak about lesser beings and proper blood. Imagine the psychological fracture for the Death Eaters watching when the most feared dark wizard in history demands submission while a half-giant surrounded by creatures and children simply refuses to kneel. And it is that image, the castle's unofficial guardian turned indomitable bulwark, that will define what Harry walks back to when he steps into the forest to die. Harry leaves the ruined courtyard, not as a boy fleeing the inevitable, but as someone walking back toward an image that has already decided who he is allowed to be. The half-giant bulwark facing Voldemort without bowing. The castle roars and sobs behind him. The ultimatum hangs over the grounds like a curse-shaped cloud. Under the invisibility cloak, his footsteps are nearly silent. Nearly. Because in this timeline, the man who has spent decades attuned to the castle's magic to the way it breathes and shifts and hides its young, feels the absence like a tooth ripped from the jaw. Hagrid is not just keeper of keys, he is a fully trained wizard professor whose loyalty has been structured into the very wards of Hogwarts. He is in the entrance hall when the tug hits him, an almost physical wrench in the chest as the subtle web of protective charms he maintains around Harry distorts. The core issue is mechanical. Hagrid has been quietly layering detection spells and creature-based wards on Harry since first year, calibrating them the way other professors calibrate essays. When Harry slips under the cloak and heads for the forest, those wards flare, then thin. Hagrid moves, not lumbering, not blundering, purposeful, wand already in his hand, the old oak polished from years of use instead of hidden in a pink umbrella. He cuts through side corridors, out across the grounds, following that psychic ache until the trees rear up before him like a black wall. At the forest's edge, he stops. The cloak ripples as Harry nearly collides with him. For a second, no one speaks. Then, Harry pulls the cloak off, and Hagrid sees his eyes. This is where the turning point arrives. Hagrid has seen Harry defiant, furious, grief-stricken. He has never seen him resolved. There is no plan in that expression, only acceptance. Hagrid understands enough to know what that means. He has graded too many essays on Horcrux theory, watched too many aura briefings about sacrificial magic to pretend this is a midnight stroll. "You're going to him," Hagrid says, voice rough, not asking. "And ye don't reckon on coming back." Harry swallows. The forest presses in, full of centaurs, acromantulas and memories. "I have to," he answers. "It's built into me, into him, into all of this." He gestures vaguely back at the castle, at the war, at the identity the world has forced on him. Hagrid's hands shake. He talks because if he stops, he will drag Harry back by force. He tells him about Godric's Hollow, about lifting a screaming baby from the rubble while the air still smelled of burnt magic and stone, about flying that motorbike through enemy skies with a promise hammered into his ribs. Keep the boy safe. He admits quietly that turning Harry into a symbol was just another way the adults tried to survive their own trauma. "You're not a weapon, Harry," he says. "You're a person. We can find another way." "Can we?" Harry asks. "Or is that just what we tell children so they don't see the cost?" Imagine the psychological fracture here, the child refusing comfort, the guardian begging for delay. Hagrid offers the only compromise his mind can bear. "Then I'm walking with you. At least a bit." They enter the forest together. The dynamic is inverted from first year. Now it is the professor who stumbles over roots as his mind reels, and the student who walks with terrible, steady power. Creatures watch them pass, sensing the peculiar magic coiled around Harry like a second skin. After a while, Hagrid stops. His promise pulls one way, his understanding of the larger war the other. The subtext is brutal. To protect the many, he must let the one child he swore to guard walk to his death. "I can't go further," he manages. "If I see him, I'll fight. And that'll ruin whatever you're trying to do." Harry nods, relief and dread mingling. He steps away deeper into the trees until his figure is swallowed by shadow. Only then does Hagrid fall to his knees, fists digging into the cold earth as if he could anchor Harry by sheer contact with the ground they share. For the first time in this repaired timeline, he wonders whether keeping his wand all those years ago was a blessing or a curse, and whether, in a few minutes, that question will even matter. The answer arrives in the clearing. The giants have been broken, chained by promises and threats they only half understand, and Hagrid, Professor Hagrid, fully trained, wand confiscated but mind unbound, is trussed between them like an exhibit. He can feel the structure of the forest around him, every root and branch humming with familiar magic, and yet he cannot move. The dynamic is obscene, the guardian of the grounds reduced to a trophy in his own domain. He sees Harry fall. In canon, we deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid stumbles into this moment as an onlooker. Here he is already present, already defeated, forced to watch as Voldemort raises the Elder Wand. The green light is not a surprise, it is an inevitability he has spent 17 years trying to outrun. Imagine the psychological fracture as he realizes that all the power he clawed back by never being expelled, all the dueling drills, all the reinforced wards and staff meetings and late-night patrols cannot intersect with this single precise killing curse. The core issue is mechanical. His arms, which have hauled hippogriffs from the sky and stunned trolls in the dungeons, are pinned. His wand, once an instrument of authority in the classroom, lies snapped at his feet as a warning to the giants. Hagrid knows 6 different shield configurations that might have intercepted that arc of green. He has practiced them with Harry. He has drilled them into DA students as last-ditch lines. None of them matter when you cannot raise your hand. Internally, something caves in. This is not just the boy who lived. This is the baby he lifted from the ruins of Godric's Hollow, the first year he walked across the lake, the teenager he dragged out of the forest when detentions went wrong. His identity as protector is not sentimental. It is the axis around which his repaired life has spun. To watch Harry crumple, apparently lifeless, is to watch that axis shatter. For a moment, Hagrid is again the third-year boy outside Dippet's office, waiting to hear if his wand, and therefore his future, will be taken. Only this time, the sentence lands on someone else. Then the turning point arrives, and it is cruelly literal. Voldemort orders him to carry the body. Hagrid resists on instinct, muscles locking, but giants and Death Eaters close in. The command is simple. Present Potter as proof. Each step back toward the castle becomes a psychological betrayal, a forced inversion of everything his life has been. These arms were trained to shield corridors, to pull wounded students behind cover during raids, to reinforce stone with silent magic. Now they must display failure. The subtext is brutal. Carrying Harry through the forest echoes that first night from the ruined cottage, but the emotional polarity has reversed. Then, he bore hope out of fire. Now he bears apparent defeat out of trees that have always been his allies. It also echoes another walk, a much younger Hagrid, leaving the dungeons in this altered history, wand in hand because Tom Riddle was exposed, future miraculously intact. The circle feels engineered to hurt, as if Voldemort has unconsciously targeted the deepest narrative ironies of Hagrid's life. By the time they reach the castle, his tears have carved tracks through blood, ash, and grime on his face. When he lays Harry down, the motion is reverent, almost liturgical, as though some part of him refuses the reality being staged. Then he looks up. There is no fear left. What stares at Voldemort is a hatred distilled over decades, from the chamber frame-up that never stuck but still scarred through every war orphan he has comforted, to this final outrage. It is the gaze of a man whose own stolen life and the boy he swore to protect have both been ground beneath the same shadow, and who, if given even a sliver of agency, will turn that trauma into the most dangerous loyalty the Dark Lord has ever underestimated. In the smoking aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts, the visual is almost painfully simple. Hagrid on his knees in the rubble, sleeves rolled up, using those same hands that once cradled a baby in a flying motorbike basket to lift shattered stone and twisted beams. Around him, auras are drawing perimeter lines, healers are triaging. Hagrid is doing all three at once. He moves from a collapsed corridor where a nest of terrified bowtruckles clings to splintered banisters to the courtyard where a thestral lies, screaming with a curse burn along its flank. His wandwork is still broad and inelegant, but now it is complete, not broken. A reinforced mobile corpus to ease pressure off a trapped Slytherin boy's leg, a murmured analgesic charm for a dying acromantula whose mind he steadies long enough to die without panic. The subtext is brutal. He has become the person who refuses to triage between human and non-human suffering. When the bodies are counted and the speeches begin, the institutional machinery grinds back to life. This is where, in the original timeline, Hagrid would recede to the edge of the frame, but the core issue is mechanical. He is no longer the barely qualified gamekeeper with an illicit umbrella. He is Professor Rubeus Hagrid, fully certified, with decades of teaching evaluations and a documented history of resisting both ministry overreach and Death Eater terror. So when the new minister convenes a series of post-war reform committees, it is not a favour when Hagrid's name appears. It is an inevitability. On the Committee for the Regulation and Protection of Magical Creatures, his testimony on giants, werewolves, and so-called beasts is entered into the record as expert evidence, not sentimental digression. Imagine the psychological fracture in a Wizengamot chamber, where the man once scapegoated for the Chamber of Secrets calmly explains how their fear-based classifications helped Voldemort recruit. Wizards who once laughed at his accent now quote his phrasing in policy drafts. We deconstruct a timeline by tracing its students. A decade on, the real proof of Hagrid's altered trajectory walks back through the Hogwarts gates wearing aura insignia, healer green, or the ink-stained fingers of magical researchers. They visit his hut, now expanded into a semi-official field lab, and they say things like, "I didn't kill the werewolf, I negotiated," or "We redesigned containment protocols because of your blast-ended Scroot unit." The pattern is consistent. His care of magical creatures classes did not just transfer knowledge, they restructured empathy. They taught that danger and dignity can occupy the same body. His personal life never simplifies into a neat redemption arc. Grawp remains a negotiation, not a solved equation. Some giants see Hagrid as a traitor to blood, others as a bridge, others as an irritant who keeps turning up with translators and treaties. He spends long weeks in the mountains, then returns to Hogwarts with new bruises and new words in the giant tongue, grieving Dumbledore in a way that is finally public. Lectures dedicated to Albus's belief in second chances, office hours that are basically informal trauma counselling. Here, the turning point arrives quietly. Hagrid does not fade back into comic relief. He becomes, almost against his own self-image, one of the moral centres of the rebuilt world, a living reminder that the system can be catastrophically wrong and that correcting it is not a speech but a lifetime of choices. The war is over, the work is not. And as the next generation files into his classroom, the question shifts. What happens when the man the system once tried to erase is now helping to write its rules? So, what does that actually do to the man at the centre of it all? When we deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid is never expelled, we are not just upgrading a side character's resume. We are re-engineering his emotional architecture. On paper, the gains look undeniable. He finishes 7 full years of magical education. The wand never breaks. The theory gaps never open. By the time Harry arrives, Hagrid is not the half-trained groundskeeper with an illicit pink umbrella, but a fully qualified professor whose care of magical creatures syllabus is cited in ministry briefs. His public vindication in the Riddle case hardens into precedent. He becomes a living legal footnote every time the Wizengamot debates, creature rights, or blood prejudice. The dynamic shifts from Dumbledore's pet project to recognised authority with voting power on school policy. Inside the castle, the benefits compound. With a staff appointment and a seat at the high table, Hagrid's mentorship of Harry and the others stops being an eccentric hobby and becomes an institutionalized reality. He can formally sponsor students for apprenticeships, argue curriculum changes, and push for protections when the chamber opens again or Umbridge arrives. Imagine the psychological fracture in a frightened second year when the man escorting you to the forest is not a suspected criminal, but the professor who just lectured on basilisk behavior and how not to die from it. But the subtext is brutal. Those gains are purchased at a cost that is not theoretical. It is measured in trauma exposure. A fully empowered Hagrid is in every war room, every late-night strategy meeting, every patrol line when the castle is under siege. He watches firsthand as Tom Riddle's schoolboy charm calcifies into Voldemort's ideology, and he cannot file it away as a misunderstanding anymore. The core issue is mechanical. The more competent and respected he is, the more directly responsible he becomes for the children under his protection. That responsibility curdles into a new kind of guilt. In this reality, when students die, Cedric, Fred, nameless bodies in shattered corridors, Hagrid is not the marginal groundskeeper carrying them out. He is the professor who signed off on their Hogsmeade permissions and argued they were ready to fight. He survives anyway, half-giant resilience turning into survivor's burden. How many funerals can a man attend before his loyalty to the institution begins to feel like complicity? This is where his identity contorts. In canon, Hagrid is the lovable outcast on the edge of the structure, safe to adore because the system has already punished him. Here he moves through phases. First, a controversial symbol of institutional failure overturned, then a lightning rod in every debate about giants, and finally a pillar of Hogwarts itself. Each promotion forces him to renegotiate his relationship with authority and rebellion. When the governors want stricter control over dangerous creatures, is he the rule maker or the man who smuggled a dragon out of a pub for the joy of it? And beneath all of that, there is the quieter, more difficult work, learning to trust the castle that almost destroyed him. He has to walk past the office where the expulsion letter was never written, sit on committees with successors of the people who would have thrown him away, and still choose to defend the walls. Forgiveness here is not a single tearful scene, it is a daily decision to stay. So is this Hagrid better? He is more powerful, more respected, more central to the fate of the school. But in gaining a permanent seat at the table, does he lose the strange, unruly freedom that once let him exist outside its expectations? The turning point arrives when we ask whether survival within the system is the same thing as healing from it. And that is where we turn next. Hagrid survives within the system. The question is what that does to the children who grow up watching him. Not just endure it, but reshape it from the inside. Harry meets a different man in that hut on the rock. The cake is still misspelled, the coat still smells of smoke and forest. But when Hagrid draws a ministry-certified wand and parts the storm with a word, Harry's first real experience of adult power is not Dursley violence or Snape's contempt. It is controlled, deliberate magic anchored to loyalty. He learns years earlier that strength can be gentle. And because Hagrid openly challenges the Dursleys yet respects Hogwarts' structure, Harry's instinctive distrust of institutions never hardens into pure rejection. He starts from, "This system failed Hagrid once," rather than, "All systems are a lie." In class, that difference becomes mechanical. When a Slytherin mutters half-breed under his breath and McGonagall deducts points before Hagrid even turns, Harry watches an institution defend someone he loves. Imagine the psychological fracture that creates compared to canon, where Hagrid is expendable. It complicates Harry's reality. If the school can protect Hagrid, why did it not protect him? His rebellion against Fudge, Umbridge, even Dumbledore becomes sharper but more focused. He is not trying to burn the house down, he is trying to remodel it in the image of the half-giant professor who proved that the walls can move. For Ron, the turning point arrives much earlier. The boy raised on hand-me-down prejudice. Giants are dangerous, werewolves are unstable, house elves are happy in chains, now eats weekly in a staff room where a half-giant jokes with Flitwick about cross-species wand safety. The subtext is brutal. If Mum and Dad were wrong about Hagrid, what else were they wrong about? So when Hermione founds SPEW, Ron's mockery lands differently. He has sat through Hagrid's story of being almost expelled for a crime he did not commit. He still rolls his eyes, but he does not dismiss the trauma. His later defense of Lupin and his uneasy respect for Firenze are seeded here, in the quiet realization that monsters keep saving his life. Hermione, meanwhile, finds in Hagrid a bridge between theory and survival. She can recite the legal status of werewolves. Hagrid can tell her what it feels like when the pub goes quiet as a half-giant walks in. We deconstruct a timeline where her activism is not just abstract ethics, but informed by lived exclusion. Her campaigns for house elves and creature rights become less paternalistic, more collaborative. She stops trying to rescue and starts trying to listen, because Hagrid has made the cost of being spoken over painfully clear. Together, the trio's dynamic shifts. Hagrid's office, stacked with lesson plans and dragonhide gloves, becomes their training ground in more than care of magical creatures. It is the one adult space where disagreement is safe. Harry can argue that Sirius is worth any risk. Hermione can insist on procedure. Ron can voice fear without being mocked, and Hagrid, visibly powerful yet permanently marked as other, models a third path. Courage that does not need an audience. They practice leadership on his turf before they ever form Dumbledore's army. But the core issue is mechanical. A stronger safety net changes how far you are willing to fall. If there is always a fully trained Hagrid to run interference with the Ministry, to reinforce the Forbidden Forest, to have a word with Dumbledore, do 3 11-year-olds hesitate before chasing a suspect into the night? Or do they push further, believing on some level that he will catch them? What happens when the net tears? The next fracture begins the night they discover it might. The net tears in silence. Not with a scream or a spell, but with a calculation made in a boy's mind years earlier, when Tom Riddle realizes his first great plan at Hogwarts has nearly been exposed by an overgrown third year who will not stop asking questions about spiders. In this altered reality, Hagrid is never expelled, never disarmed, never turned into the convenient monster. The Ministry pins the chamber's closure on mysterious circumstances, and Riddle walks away technically clean, but not unwatched. The core issue is mechanical. He has learned that Hogwarts contains a variable he did not account for, a half-giant with a wand, institutional backing, and a dangerous intuition for when creatures are being used. So Riddle adapts. His early recruitment of disaffected Slytherins becomes slower, quieter, more psychologically precise. No flashy experiments with cursed objects lying around the castle, fewer theatrical displays of power in the dungeons. He pushes his darker work off-campus earlier into nocturne basements and orphanage visits, because a fully trained Hagrid can follow tracks in the forest that a prefect cannot even see. The turning point arrives before anyone names it. Voldemort is forced from adolescence to think like a hunted thing. Decades later, that caution metastasizes into strategy. When we deconstruct a timeline where Hagrid is a professor of care of magical creatures, not merely keeper of keys, Voldemort's battlefield calculus at Hogwarts changes. You do not storm a castle whose grounds are effectively commanded by a half-giant who can rally centaurs, acromantulas and thestrals with a few shouted words and a wand that actually works. You probe, you isolate, you send assassins, not armies. Imagine the psychological fracture for Death Eaters raised on pure-blood supremacy when their master warns in private that underestimating the half-breed is fatal. Publicly, their propaganda compensates. The rhetoric against giants, werewolves, and half-breeds becomes even more dehumanizing, more explicit. Hagrid, visible on the staff table, laughing with first years and escorting Muggleborns to the forest for carefully controlled lessons, becomes an icon of inclusive power. The subtext is brutal. To maintain their ideology, they must paint that image as an aberration that must be erased. Dumbledore, acutely aware of this, weaponizes Hagrid twice over. There are missions where Hagrid is the blunt instrument, frontline escort for high-risk witnesses, shock presence in negotiations with giants that might otherwise end in blood. But there are also nights when he is the diplomat, the only one who can walk into a werewolf encampment or a herd of terrified hippogriffs and speak in a language that is not purely human. In canon, those talks fail or never occur. Here, some of them work. A giant clan refuses a Death Eater alliance. A pack of acromantulas does not intervene on Voldemort's side. Lives that once vanished in the margins of the war quietly remain. Pattern interrupt. This does not make the war gentler. Every time Voldemort meets resistance he had not planned for, he escalates. If Hogwarts cannot be taken by a single decisive strike, he turns to siege, starvation, and targeted terror against creature lovers. If Hagrid survives one assassination attempt, the next goes after his students. The dynamic hardens. Loyalty on one side, cruelty on the other. Each response raising the temperature until the castle is not merely a school, but a pressure cooker where the next fracture is inevitable. And when that fracture finally comes, it will not begin with a prophecy. It will begin with a hunt. The hunt ends, years later, in a room that is not supposed to exist. Not a forest, not a battlefield, but a cold, forgotten chamber of stone and silver, where reality itself bends around an ancient piece of magic. The mirror of Erised waits, unchanged, while everyone who stands before it is not. Today we deconstruct a timeline by placing not an orphaned boy in front of it, but a whole Hagrid. Canon gives us a different image. Imagine the psychological fracture of 13-year-old Rubeus Hagrid, one snapped, name blackened, standing in front of this glass. In that version of reality, he might have seen himself robed and one ready, seated at the staff table as a real wizard. Friends flanking him who do not flinch at his height or his blood, the spider in the box vindicated, the expulsion erased. A boy frozen at the moment before his life broke, begging the mirror to rewind the fracture. But the turning point arrives when we change the premise. In this timeline, Hagrid was never expelled, his wand never taken, his education never truncated into a half-life of umbrellas and apologetic magic. He has already lived the fantasy that canon Hagrid would have begged for. So when the war is over and the castle is scarred, he returns to the same secret room as an old man in professor's robes, invited by Harry, who remembers what this mirror once did to him. Seen first, his reflection is almost mundane. He sees himself at the staff table. Yes, broad shoulders wrapped in formal robes that finely fit, his wand resting openly on the polished wood. The power dynamic is reversed. There is no pretense, No need to hide. McGonagall leans in to say something dry. Firenze inclines his head. A goblin liaison occupies a seat that once would have been politically impossible. Hagrid is not on the margins of the institution. He is part of its structure. Then the frame widens. The core issue is mechanical. The mirror does not show career advancement. It shows desire. So the image pulls back, past the candles, down to the house tables. Centaurs and humans share benches. A werewolf marks essays at the end of Ravenclaw. A muggle-born girl chats easily with a boy whose family once followed Voldemort. A tiny herd of house elves, uniforms unchained from servitude, serve food as paid staff. No one is flinching at fangs, at scars, at lineage. The subtext is brutal in its simplicity. Safety has become ordinary. Hagrid's deepest wish has migrated. Once it would have been personal validation, the restoration of his own identity as a proper wizard. Now, after a full education, a professorship, and a war in which his loyalty was never in question, that wound has scarred over. His desire is structural change, a Hogwarts where no child carries his particular trauma, where no one is hunted because of blood or species. And Harry, standing beside him in this altered reality, is looking at the same glass. What does he see now, when the first adult wizard he ever trusted was not a broken groundskeeper, but a powerful, unashamed Hagrid who never hid his wand? We will come back to that reflection. Harry's reflection is the easy one to analyse. Power, protection, a competent adult who does not fail him at 11. Hagrid's is harder. In canon, his life is built out of small, stubborn joys pressed against a wall of institutional rejection. The pumpkin patch under grey Scottish skies, kettles whistling in a lopsided hut that smells of wet dog and treacle, the illicit dragon egg on the table, his eyes bright with childlike awe as he explains Norbert's feeding schedule with the seriousness of a healer discussing surgery. These are not the trappings of power, they are the rituals of survival. In the alternate timeline, we deconstruct a timeline where those rituals are replaced by office hours, lesson plans, and staff meetings about corridor patrols. Hagrid's days are no longer structured around tea with whoever is brave enough to visit the edge of the forest. They are structured around syllabi, OWL results, and the quiet humiliation of performance reviews from a ministry that once would not have hired him to sweep floors. The subtext is brutal. To keep this position, he must be excellent, not merely good. Canon Hagrid's outsider status, while cruel, gives him a strange psychological freedom. He answers mostly to Dumbledore and to his own instincts. If he wants to spend 3 nights in the forest coaxing a traumatized hippogriff to trust again, he does it. If he chooses loyalty to a giant colony over public opinion, there is no committee to censure him. His identity is anchored in creatures and in a handful of students who see past the beard and the rumours. Professor Hagrid does not have that luxury. The core issue is mechanical. The higher he climbs in Hogwarts' hierarchy, the more he must perform professionalism to justify his place. Every lesson becomes an argument against the old accusation that he is dangerous and incompetent. Every minor injury in care of magical creatures is political ammunition. Imagine the psychological fracture of knowing that one inattentive moment with a blast-ended scroot could undo decades of painstaking legitimacy. And then there is the burden. In canon, when students are hurt, Hagrid feels guilt, but it is diffuse, shared with an abstract Hogwarts. As a professor and an order commander, the line of responsibility tightens. A maimed student in a battle is not just a tragedy, it is a failure of his defensive strategy, his ward placement, his split-second decisions. He is no longer allowed to be messy, credulous Hagrid who buys a dragon from a cloaked stranger. He must be the adult who does not get fooled. Visibility magnifies all of this. The marginal gamekeeper can be scapegoated, yes, but he can also be quietly ignored by Death Eaters and bureaucrats alike. A half-giant professor and war leader, by contrast, is a walking symbol. To some, proof that blood prejudice is dying. To others, proof that it has gone too far. Both sides want to use him. Both sides are willing to destroy him. So we arrive at the uncomfortable question. If you offered Hagrid the wand he never lost, the title he never held, and the guilt that comes with them, would he take it? Or if he could see the full emotional ledger of both lives, would he choose the crooked hut, the pumpkins, and the injustice he already knows how to survive? The answer to that may depend on one night, one decision, and one student who refuses to let him stand alone. The student who refuses to let him stand alone is not famous. They are not the chosen one. They are a terrified second-year muggle-born who has heard the whispers about the half-giant in the forest and walks toward him anyway. That small act of loyalty is where we deconstruct a timeline, because in this reality, Hagrid's arc is not exile and partial restoration. It is near erasure, then slow, stubborn belonging. He begins as the boy Hogwarts nearly spits out of its structure, the child whose wand is almost snapped because he is too big, too poor, too associated with the wrong creatures. But the turning point arrives when he keeps that wand, sits his OWLS badly but honestly, and years later, takes a post not as tolerated groundskeeper, but as a professor who designs the syllabus instead of apologizing for it. That shift reframes Hogwarts itself. The castle that once used him as a cautionary tale becomes, over decades, a place Hagrid literally reshapes. Paddocks carved into the grounds, reinforced wards that recognize hippogriffs as residents, not threats, and a staff room where a half-giant's chair is not a joke but standard furniture. Belonging stops being a conditional privilege and starts to look like an operational principle. Yet the subtext is brutal. Correcting one injustice does not dissolve the prejudice that produced it. The Ministry still flinches at his file. The Daily Prophet still reaches for his name when a creature attacks. It is mechanically convenient to blame the visibly different. Even well-meaning colleagues, people who vote for progressive creature rights bills, hesitate before backing his more radical proposals. Imagine the psychological fracture of hearing, "We trust you with our children," followed by, "but perhaps not with werewolf apprentices just yet." The core issue is mechanical. Power in this world flows through titles, wands, and narratives. Giving Hagrid a fully functional wand and a chair at the staff table grants him real leverage. He can veto dangerous ministry decrees on Hogwarts grounds, organize defensive wards before the first Death Eater crosses the boundary, and teach students to see giants, centaurs, and acromantulas as part of a wider magical ecology rather than monsters. But that same power paints a target on his back. When he shields a group of Muggleborns during the first skirmish at the gates, the photographs in the Prophet do not show the children. They show the half-giant towering over auras, an easy visual for uncontrolled force. This is where the alternate reality brushes uncomfortably close to ours. Institutions, magical or otherwise, are very efficient at labeling some bodies excess. Too large, too foreign, too disruptive to the clean lines of policy. Reforming that from the outside looks heroic. Reforming it from the inside looks like Hagrid in a cramped committee room, reading bylaws at midnight, arguing that centaur territories deserve ward protections, and realizing the people nodding along will still panic when a hoofprint appears near Hogsmeade. Pattern interrupt. Even here, he does not win cleanly. He still loses students in the war. He still hears slurs in the corridors, thrown softer now, but thrown. He still has nights where he stares at his intact wand and wonders whether the price of being visible, empowered, and perpetually scrutinized is just a different flavor of exile. The victory is not that the trauma disappears, it is that he has the power and the community to keep pushing the line of what belonging at Hogwarts can mean. And as the battle lines harden outside the castle walls, that question, how far belonging can stretch before it breaks, will determine not just Hagrid's fate, but the moral architecture of the war itself. So we return to where the fracture nearly became permanent. The dungeon is cold again, torches guttering, shadows throwing third-year Hagrid's bulk against stone like an accusation made visible. In canon, this is the room where his life collapses. A dead girl, a dead rooster, a box with something chittering inside, and Tom Riddle's immaculate testimony slicing through the air. But here we deconstruct a timeline where the script does not run on rails. Watch the scene replay, but with a split screen of futures layered over it. As Riddle points, as the word monster hangs in the air, we see, over his shoulder, Hagrid years later in professor's robes, ink on his fingers, coaxing nervous second years toward a skittish hippogriff. We see him on the Battle of Hogwarts ramparts, whole wand raised, hurling a shield charm that absorbs a volley of green light. We see a rain-soaked hut door opening, Harry's first unsure smile meeting not a semi-legal umbrella, but a clearly drawn wand and a clearly defined identity. I'm Professor Hagrid. I've been looking for you. The turning point arrives not with new evidence, but with an adult refusing to abdicate responsibility. Dumbledore stands, voice very quiet, and asks the question no one wants to hear. Where is the proof? Not the prejudice, not the narrative convenience, the proof. Imagine the psychological fracture in that room as the power dynamic shifts. A respected teacher challenging the golden boy, insisting that magic leaves traces, that accusations require structure. In the canon timeline, the silence that follows is lethal. No one intervenes. The core issue is mechanical. A boy with status speaks, a boy without status breaks, and a wand is snapped. Trauma is bureaucratized into 3 clean outcomes: expulsion, exile, and a lifetime of half education that will later make Hagrid an easy scapegoat when the chamber opens again. Here, Dumbledore's refusal to look away forces the Ministry to investigate the actual creature. Aragog is removed, the trail to the basilisk is at least partially illuminated, and Riddle's first crime does not disappear into the stone. Hagrid is terrified, reprimanded, watched closely, but he is not broken. His wand remains whole, so does he. The contrast between timelines is brutal. In one, Hagrid shuffles at the margins, his magic mediated through pink umbrellas and good intentions, forever framed as a danger that must be managed. In the other, his full education turns him into a competent duelist, a formal care of magical creatures professor, and a man whose authority means that when he says that werewolf is safe or that giant deserves a trial, policy actually shifts. Count the ripples. How many first years avoid fatal panic in the Forbidden Forest because Hagrid can cast a Patronus big enough to hold the dark at bay? How many so-called dangerous creatures are classified more humanely because the leading expert is not an expendable gamekeeper but a credentialed academic? How many half-bloods and muggle-borns see a half-giant at the staff table and quietly reconfigure what belonging can mean? The subtext is brutal. One adult's courage converts a future scapegoat into a future shelter. The same boy who might have been locked out of magic instead becomes the man who stands between children and the war bearing down on them. So hold the 2 dungeons in your mind, the wand snapping versus the wand defended. Which Hogwarts would you rather inhabit as a scared 11-year-old? And as we move into the final movements of this alternate history, that split screen will decide not just Hagrid's fate, but what kind of institution Hogwarts chooses to be when the next child stands accused. So hold the 2 dungeons in your mind, the wand snapping versus the wand defended. Which Hogwarts would you rather inhabit as a scared 11-year-old? As we move into your part of this experiment, that split screen isn't just academic, it's emotional. It's about which scar you consider more bearable. So, your turn in the Great Hall. Out of everything we've walked through in this altered reality, which single moment hit you hardest? Was it Hagrid descending into the chamber, not as a scapegoat but as a sanctioned hunter of the basilisk, finally standing in the exact room where his life was almost destroyed and refusing to flinch? Was it that quiet forest walk where he chooses to bring students into danger, trusting their agency, and you feel the psychological fracture between protector and commander? Or was it the Battle of Hogwarts, where a fully trained Hagrid on the front lines stops being background spectacle and becomes a deliberate instrument of power? When we deconstruct a timeline, the temptation is to count victories. But here, the core issue is mechanical. Which life would you actually choose for him? On one side, canon Hagrid, marginalized, half-trained, underestimated, tucked away at the edge of the grounds, his trauma partially cushioned by low expectations. On the other, this Hagrid, professor, duelist, policy target, carrying the weight of every creature he defends and every student he arms for war. If you had the authority to fix only one reality, which version of Hagrid's identity would you lock in, and why? Extend that judgment outward. Does this Hagrid change who your favorite character is? If he's a visible, competent authority in Harry's life from day one, does that pull emotional gravity away from Lupin, from Sirius, even from McGonagall? Imagine the psychological fracture in Harry himself if his first model of adult loyalty is not a gentle outcast, but a respected professor who openly challenges the Ministry. Do you think Harry survives this war without that version of Hagrid at his back? Or does the increased responsibility on Hagrid simply move the casualty lines somewhere else? Notice how many research threads this single non-expulsion tugs. Ministry politics. A half-giant professor forces Fudge and later Scrimgeour to show their hand much earlier. Creature rights. A man who can quote both Care of Magical Creatures theory and Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures bylaws becomes impossible to sideline. Tom Riddle's exposure, a solved chamber case in the 1940s, rewires his legend from golden boy to near-miss criminal. Which of those lines would you want us to follow in forensic detail, committee hearings, curriculum changes, or the slow demolition of Riddle's schoolboy myth? Because the turning point arrives here, with you. The next What If is going to dig into another foundational injustice in Hogwarts structure, Snape's early choices, Sirius Black's imprisonment, or even the career McGonagall might have had if she hadn't chained herself to this castle. The subtext is brutal. Change one decision, and the entire moral architecture of the series tilts. Tell me in the comments which fracture we open next, because the next timeline may make this one look merciful. So why does this one hurt more than the others? Why does deconstructing a timeline where Hagrid keeps his wand feel less like clever fan theory and more like attending a quiet funeral for a life that never happened? Because once you see it, you can't unsee the theft. One lie from Tom Riddle, one cowardly headmaster who decides a frightened third-year half-giant is easier to sacrifice than confront a charismatic prefect, and an entire future evaporates. The subtext is brutal. The Hogwarts we grew up loving is also the institution that decided Hagrid's education, dignity, and legal standing were acceptable collateral damage. Imagine the psychological fracture for viewers who always felt safe behind the castle's warm glow. In canon, Hagrid's expulsion is backstory, a tragic anecdote wrapped in his usual cheer. Here, when we watch him sit in a fully earned staff meeting, wand on the table, trading theory with Flitwick and McGonagall as an equal, we feel the gap. We are seeing the negative space of canon. Every competent spell he casts in this reality is a reminder of the power he was denied in the original. That is the draw of these what-ifs. They are not just narrative toys, they are controlled burn chambers for regret. We grieve what could have been. A Hagrid who duels Death Eaters on the ramparts, who never has to hide magic in a pink umbrella, while still appreciating the man who, with half an education, still drags a baby across a war-torn sky and builds a home out of a wooden hut. We hold both timelines in our hands and let the ache do its work. On some level, this is personal. Many people watching know what it is to be underestimated in a room, to be quietly moved to the margins because they do not fit the preferred shape. Many know what it is to be scapegoated, to have a convenient narrative fastened to their identity and then treated as reality. When the Ministry ships Hagrid off to Azkaban during the Second Chamber Crisis, we recognize the pattern. When, in this alternate structure, he stands in front of the Wizengamot as a respected expert on magical creatures instead, we recognize the fantasy. The core issue is mechanical. We are not fixing Rowling's story as if one fan video could overwrite a global text. We are holding up a mirror to its blind spots. After walking through a world where Hagrid is professor, not pet project, it becomes impossible to reread the original without noticing every time the narrative uses him as comic relief or convenient muscle instead of a full subject. But here is the pattern interrupt. Imagining gentler realities is not escapism. It is an act of quiet resistance. When we picture Hagrid leading defensive lines at the Battle of Hogwarts, or mentoring a terrified Muggleborn who sees themselves in his size and softness, we are rehearsing a world where institutions choose protection over expedience. That rehearsal matters. And as we move into the next phase of this timeline, we are going to test exactly how far that kind of world can bend before it breaks. So when we deconstruct a timeline where that kind of world holds, for once, we have to return to the hinge. The divergence is deceptively simple. Hagrid is not expelled. His wand is not snapped. Tom Riddle is not believed. A frightened half-giant boy is allowed to stay inside the castle's structure, rather than being exiled to its margins with a bucket and a keyring. Imagine the psychological fracture that never happens. No third year dragged from the Great Hall as a monster. No ministry decree turning a child into a cautionary tale. Instead, we see Hagrid trudging back to lessons, cheeks still wet, clutching a wand that now represents both trauma and possibility. The subtext is brutal. The institution that nearly failed him chooses this time to do the administrative work of doubt. From there, the arc is almost mechanical. The core issue is mechanical. Give Hagrid 7 full years of magical education, theory of transfiguration, advanced charms, actual dueling practice, and you do not just get a slightly more competent groundskeeper. You get a wizard who can cast non-verbal shields in the Forbidden Forest, who can repair shattered bones without panic, who can stand in a corridor beside McGonagall and hold the line. The turning point arrives when that competence is formalized, not as a pity post, but as a professorship. Care of magical creatures stops being the eccentric side module and becomes a rigorous exploration of magical ecology, taught by a half-giant who has survived acromantulas and dragons and can articulate why power without empathy is a design flaw. Hagrid at the staff table is no longer an anomaly. He is precedent. Across both wars, that precedent matters. In the first rise of Voldemort, Hagrid is not merely Dumbledore's loyal errand runner. He is a field operative whose size and magic combine into a defensive engine escorting Muggle-born families, negotiating with giants from a position of parity rather than pleading. In the second, he is not carted off to Azkaban as an easy scapegoat when the Chamber of Secrets reopens. Instead, his earlier vindication means the Ministry has to look at Tom Riddle's legacy directly. They lose their convenient monster. They gain an inconvenient witness. Relationships reconfigure around that new identity. Harry does not just meet a gentle smuggler of dragon eggs, he inherits a mentor who can actually demonstrate complex shield charms, who can stand between him and a Death Eater and not immediately be overwhelmed. The dynamic with the Ministry becomes almost ironically sophisticated. Hagrid as both thorn and advisor, a figure they call when they need giant diplomacy, then regret calling when he reminds them what their own laws say about Centaur territory. And under all of that, there is the slow, uneven reconciliation between Hagrid and himself. The shame of being too big, too clumsy, too dangerous never fully evaporates, but it is counterweighted by decades of students who trust him with their fear, by creatures who respond to his voice, by colleagues who defer to his expertise. He becomes a symbol not of exception, but of what happens when an institution chooses to repair rather than discard. So we end this phase of the story where we began. In the Great Hall, Hagrid at the staff table, laughing too loudly, gesturing with a wand that was never broken, splashing gravy on his beard while a first year waves at him from Hufflepuff. The war is over. His life is messy, compromised, politically untidy, but it is fully his. And as we move into our final question, what this Hagrid means for the legacy of Hogwarts itself, we carry that image as our anchor. So here is where you come in. We have walked Hagrid all the way from that almost expulsion in a damp dungeon corridor to the staff table at the Victory Feast. Wand intact, identity restored. But the core issue is mechanical now. Which single moment in canon do you most want to see broken open and rebuilt around this version of Hagrid? Name it explicitly in the comments so we can deconstruct a timeline together. Is it the first meeting in Philosopher's Stone with a fully qualified Professor Hagrid kicking down the door on Privet Drive, not as a bumbling outsider, but as an official Hogwarts emissary with Ministry wards snapping at his heels? Is it the Forbidden Forest detention, where his authority and power make that night less child endangerment and more deliberate initiation into the psychological reality of the war? Or the Tower with a Hagrid who can duel, who can throw shields between Dumbledore and Green Light? Or the final battle where he is not just carrying Harry's body, but commanding the creature battalions he has spent a lifetime protecting? Choose one. Write the scene you want rewritten. Forest, Tower, Stone, or Final Battle. And add one sentence about how you imagine the psychological fracture changes when Hagrid is no longer half-educated and half-believed. The subtext is brutal in each case, and your answers will decide which sequence we fully reconstruct in a future episode. And because this is not a one-off thought experiment, but an ongoing project of fixing magical injustices one character at a time, I want you to vote on our next fracture point. Do we stay with Slytherin and ask, what if Snape never became a Death Eater, forcing us to examine loyalty, power, and self-hatred without the dark mark as anchor? Do we move to the Marauders era with, what if Sirius had a trial, and watch the entire structure of the Ministry's lies start to wobble? Or do we shift straight into institutional reform with, what if McGonagall was headmistress from the start, and see how a different hand on the tiller reshapes Hogwarts itself? Type Snape, Sirius, or McGonagall in the comments. The turning point arrives where the majority of you point. If you know someone who always defends Hagrid, who quotes "I am what I am" like a personal creed, or that friend who can recite obscure creature lore while pretending they are not crying about Buckbeak, send this video to them. frame it as what it is: a love letter to the series' gentlest giant, finally given the power and respect he was denied. If you want to be part of this longer meta project, where we do not just rant about injustice in this fictional world, but methodically reconstruct it, like the video, subscribe, and stay. That is how you join the ongoing experiment where we deconstruct a timeline, then another, then another. Because soon, we stop treating these what-ifs as isolated pocket realities. Soon, we start asking what happens when Snape never joins the Death Eaters in the same universe where Hagrid is never expelled, where Sirius is exonerated, where McGonagall runs Hogwarts from day one. A world where every fracture we have healed collides into a radically different castle. That collision is where we are going next. That collision is where we are going next. But before we deconstruct a timeline where every fracture is healed at scale, we narrow the frame back down to one room, one man, and one quiet evening that exists in both realities. It is dusk at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Inside the hut, the fire has settled into that low, steady crackle that makes the walls feel closer rather than cramped. Fang is already asleep, a massive, ungainly heap of loyalty at Hagrid's boots. On the table, a stack of essays on hippogriff behavior, parchment edges curled from use, and a chipped mug of tea warming his hand. In canon, this is the Gamekeeper's refuge, the half-giant with the pink umbrella pretending not to be a wizard. In our alternate structure, this is the office of a fully accredited professor, his wand resting openly beside the marking quill. But the contrast is almost cosmetic. The core issue is mechanical: titles, credentials, ministry paperwork. The core identity never moves. Whether he is Keeper of Keys or Master of Magical Creatures, he is still the man who sees power in what everyone else calls dangerous and worth in what everyone else calls a mistake. Imagine the psychological fracture if you tried to separate those two Hagrids to insist that one is more real than the other. You cannot. The dynamic is stable across both versions. He will overcook the rock cakes. He will underestimate the trauma of a blast-ended Scroot. He will overestimate a first year's courage and then stand in front of them when reality bites back. So we pause here, in universe, and say something that the characters never quite managed to articulate. Thank you, Rubeus Hagrid. Thank you for being the first magical adult to look at a boy in a cupboard and speak the sentence that rewires his fate. You're a wizard, Harry. Thank you too for being that voice for readers and viewers who needed an enormous gentleman to insist that their existence was not a clerical error. Here is your invitation the next time you reread or rewatch. Notice every scene where Hagrid is underestimated, dismissed, or used as a scapegoat. The Chamber of Secrets arrests, the Ministry's suspicion, the jokes about his intellect. Then, mentally overlay this alternate Hagrid standing a little taller in those moments, wand visible, Professor's robes singed from the lesson that went wrong, and still refusing to apologize for loving the creatures no one else will touch. The turning point arrives not with a battle, but with a door. Hagrid drains the last of his tea, sets down his quill, and rises. He takes a lantern from its hook, opens the hut door, and steps into the cool night air. The castle looms above, not as the place that expelled him, but as the home that never let him go. Behind him, the hut light stays on, a small, stubborn square of warmth against the dark. A signal to lost first years, to misfit creatures, to anyone who has ever felt too big, too clumsy, too wrong for this world of magic. Somewhere in that glow, both Hagrids coexist. The Gamekeeper with the umbrella wand and the Professor with full credentials, fused into one continuous act of loyalty. When you close this video and return to your own reality, carry that image with you. Hagrid's lantern bobbing toward a castle he never had to leave, the door behind him never fully shut. Because in every version of this story, he is still doing the same quiet, radical thing. He is leaving the light on for whoever needs it next.